Hey, folks, and welcome to the show. It's ya dude, the unconquerable Wafflesaurus gamer. Today, I've got a real treat for you. As far as jobs go, flying free to Japan to edit footage was pretty good. I'd been the other half of my best friend's YouTube channel for nearly 2 years now, his dedicated editor and sometimes cameraman when the need arose. Travis, or Wafflesaurus Gamer, as he was known on YouTube, had a fairly popular Let's Play channel, in which he played everything from the shiniest new games, to the oldest retro titles, to the most ghastly train wrecks the internet has to offer. He had a modest fan base that seemed to like his Logan Paul-esque style, and the guests he had from time to time were entertaining enough to hold the attention of an 8 to 25-year-old demographic. 2 weeks ago, though, someone had sent him a weird one. The guy claimed to be from the outskirts of Japan, said he and his brother had gone to a game parlor with a reputation for obscure titles. They had gone to play a game that had been stirring up rumors in their little town, a game called Your Corner of Hell. The writer said very little was known about the game, but some kids in the village were supposed to have gone crazy or killed themselves because of the things they had seen in the game. The two had, of course, wanted to play this mysterious game. The owner had heard their request, money had changed hands, and the guy and his brother had been invited to the back of the arcade to play the game. The older brother had gone first. The room had a one-occupant rule, and the younger brother waited for a while his brother played for what seemed like hours. We went into the arcade at 10:30, just as they opened, but my brother didn't come out of that room until well past dark. The younger brother had sat for around an hour before boredom brought him back into the arcade. I spent several hours playing the machines, down to the lint in my pockets, and still he hadn't come out. As the sun went down, he heard a commotion near the front. The owner was carrying someone over his shoulder and shouting at the younger brother to get lost. The owner shoved him from behind, his meaty hand moving him easily. When the younger brother was on the sidewalk, the owner had tossed the thing that he'd been carrying onto the pavement and shuttered his shop up for the night. The thing he had been carrying turned out to be the boy's older brother. He was unconscious. The doctors say he's in some kind of coma and he may never recover. The owner denied that he'd ever even seen us, of course, and he has some kind of connections that keep the police from investigating him too closely. I know you play weird games, and I hate to bring you into something like this, but could you please go and try to find this game? The man at the parlor will let you in the back if you tell him Lilith sent you. Please, if you can find out what my brother saw, maybe they can help him. And now, here we were, standing outside the shabby arcade. We had flown into Hiroshima and taken a train out to the town of Tomanoru so we could meet the younger brother, a 15-year-old named Hisu. He recounted the tale to us as we sat in his mother's kitchen and drank some strong tea. The boy's hands had trembled as he spoke, and he seemed on the verge of tears as he retold his story. My parents are at the hospital with Ichi, praying that he will recover. He was supposed to go to university this year, but now it's unlikely that he will ever recover. The kid's English was pretty good, but when Travis asked if he wanted to come with us, I didn't need words to read the terror on his face. I haven't been back since the incident. I won't go near it again. A lot of kids in the village won't go there anymore either, not after what happened to Ichi. He wished us luck and said that he would pray for our return. Standing outside the grungy arcade, I didn't see what all the fuss was about. The facade was filthy, ivy hanging from the canopy, and bars installed over the dingy windows. The dust on the windows looked like you could have written in it, and the spiderwebs in the corners looked old enough to have seen the Reagan administration. The door was a black, gaping mouth with a roll-down shutter that would lock at night. As we stood, I could hear the beeps and plinks from inside, the familiar sounds of Pac-Man and Street Fighter, and the sounds were comforting somehow. Even in this foreign land, the sounds of familiar games could bring me comfort. "So, got everything hooked up?" I asked, going over his setup one more time. His glasses were set up with a pair of digital recorders that were damn near undetectable. As he recorded, the camera feed would be continuously uploading to the cloud. I could pick through the footage later and edit it into something usable for the channel. Since I couldn't come with him, he would have to record his events as he saw them. I was mostly on location to call the police if anything weird happened. A few local kids may not pique the police's interest, but an American tourist with 500,000 sub count might make them a little more willing to investigate this place. It made me feel like a real reporter, working in the field to expose the truth. How quickly we forget that those people, too, can die. It's as ready as it'll ever be. Let's see if there's anything to see, Travis said. A big grin spread across his face. We walked into the building that was awash with blinking lights and a cacophony of sounds. Children of all ages were hunkered over the blinking machines. Others were running around and laughing as they tried to find their favorite games. I could hear the wooden chunk of a skee-ball machine, the metallic clink of an air hockey table as the puck zipped around the smooth surface, the hollow boom of a shooting game, and the pop tunes of Dance Dance Revolution. The owner had a modest collection of classic arcade cabinets as well, and even at a glance, I could tell that this was a place that made money. Standing behind the counter, looming like a monster amidst the brightly colored prizes and flashing signs, was a giant, grinning man. He was easily 7 feet tall, and nearly as wide. He had an oily mustache that sat under a bulbous, greasy nose, and his eyes were like a mean-spirited pig that loves to snap at curious children. He reminded me of a picture book I had owned as a child, Puss in Boots, and how the ogre had made me feel scared. The warty ogre had sat on his cushion in his beautiful clothes and looked down at the cat as it wove its lies. Even as a child, I had thought the look made him look menacing. It was a look that said plainly the cat was in danger of being devoured. The man spoke to Travis in what I assumed was Japanese, a language I was not familiar with, and Travis spoke back to him with relative ease. The man smiled, showing several blackened teeth, and spoke to Travis in English, though this English sounded more like European than actual American English. "Ah, an American. So word of my special game has spread that far, eh?" "Infamy more like it," Travis said. The man's smile looked a little off after that. "You'll need to sign a waiver if you'd like to play. After the last incident, I really must protect myself from further accusations." Travis scanned the document, looking for traps, and I asked the owner about the game. "What is it that seems to be making your customers react so badly?" "Well, there are the usual rumors that surround the game. The creator died, his spirit haunts the game is actually a portal to hell. Many strange rumors surround my little shop, but I can assure you that the game is just a regular game, nothing special that need elicit such reactions." Travis had finished signing the paperwork and was ready to see this game. "Only one of you at a time, boys. You'll have to wait out here," he said, pointing a dirty finger at me as Travis stepped behind the counter. The last time I saw Travis, he flashed me a peace sign and smiled with a big grin. "See you on the other side," he intoned. Then he disappeared into the shadowy back room as I remained in the world of flashing lights and familiar sounds. I turned away from the counter and found myself drawn by the brightly colored lights and the machine's electronic blare. I spent some time playing familiar games: Tekken, Marvel vs. Capcom, Time Crisis 2, House of the Dead. I took a spin at Initial D, a very intuitive racing game, and had my ass handed to me by a local kid at Street Fighter 2. These same kids then talked me into playing Dance Dance Revolution with them, and I had a blast as I tripped along to several of the fast and bubbly songs they picked. I lost track of time for a while, enjoying myself, enjoying the company of kids half my age who didn't speak a word of my language. When a shadow fell across us, though, their smiling faces curdled and they scattered like birds. I looked up from some unpronounceable game that hadn't made it to America and found the owner standing over me, 2 large men flanking him. He looked angry, his face wooden yet still smiling, and he told me to get my things and leave. I was shocked. Was he kicking me out? Had I violated some unknown rule? I had easily spent $50 in this place, and the idea that he was here to pull me out made no sense. I'm here with my friend, the one in the back. I'll leave when he finishes his... He's gone. He broke a costly machine and left out the back. Now I want you gone, too, before I call the authorities. Wait, I stammered. Which way did he go? I'm a stranger here. I don't know any... But it seemed they weren't here to negotiate with me. The 2 large men had me under the arms in a heartbeat, and before I knew it, I was half drugged, half carried from the shop. They deposited me onto the sidewalk with a distinct lack of grace, and the owner stood in the doorway as I got up and stood with confusion. "You and your friend are banned. Leave the premises before I call the authorities," he said, evenly, before slamming the shutter down in my face. That's how I came to be outside the dingy shop without Travis, half a world from home with no clue how to get back. I had no choice but to walk to the Harzows residence. He was the only person I knew in Tamanoru, and without knowing how to speak the language, I was practically helpless. Hisawa spoke English, Hisawa knew the area, and Hisawa knew the people that lived in the village. Hopefully one of them could help me find Travis, and I could get him through whatever was going on so we could get home. Also, Hisawa had a computer, which I would need to find Travis. Travis had gone to the back wearing the glasses. The camera on those glasses had been uploading to the cloud for the past 5 hours. If I could link up with the cloud, I could watch the video he had uploaded and get some ideas of where he was going. That would allow me to find him and get us both back home. If only it had been that easy. Hisawa, it turned out, wasn't home. His house was locked up, and the lights inside were dark. He had probably gone to see his brother in the hospital, and as dusk began to set, I made my way back into town. I was looking for somewhere, anywhere with Wi-Fi, to access the videos on my phone. It wouldn't be as stable as accessing them from a dedicated connection, but if it helped me find Travis, I didn't care how I went about it. It was getting dark, and I started to worry that I wouldn't find him until morning. When the familiar arches of a McDonald's came into view, I breathed a sigh of relief. They had Wi-Fi, and after purchasing some food, I was pretty hungry after not eating all day, I plopped down in a booth near the back wall and made my way into the file program. The file was there, but the program had stopped updating about 20 minutes ago. That was weird, but if he had wandered off the signal range, it could be that the program couldn't get a connection anymore. I clicked on the file and got 6 hours worth of video. I gasped. Surely I hadn't been in the arcade that long. It didn't feel like I had been in there any time, but my stomach was empty, and I had been known to lose track of time when I was playing games. I ate as the file finished downloading. I had finished my food when a message popped up that the files were ready to view. The video began as we walked on the sidewalk. I heard myself asked if the equipment was working okay. We walked inside, spoke with the owner, and I could hear myself asking questions as Travis looked over the paperwork. He signed, followed the guy into the back, and turned suddenly to treat me to a last look at my worried face. "See you on the other side," he intoned, before turning back and walking into the dim back room. He walked past a line of overstuffed shelves to a hallway with several closed doors. Some of the doors had shadow lights beneath them, shadowy forms doing God knew what, but the man led him to a particular door and opened it with a key. Inside was a sit-down cabinet similar to the old joystick arcade games. The cabinet filled the room, and there was barely enough room to enter as Travis stepped inside. "When you're done, lock the door as you leave," the man said, his almost European tone still hanging over his voice, not like the angry one I had gotten as he threw me on the sidewalk. Then he closed the door, and Travis was alone with the softly glowing screen. The screen was large, 50 inches at least, and the words "Your Corner of Hell" pulsated across it. Travis looked for a coin slot and found none. He sat down and grasped the joystick, a single piece of plastic with no buttons or triggers. He looked around for a start button. Travis spoke to the audience, telling them that this was the game that had garnered all the hype, and he was going to see what all the fuss was about. He had just said something about not finding a start button when the screen emitted an odd static noise and bathed the room in a harsh white light. Travis snapped his eyes forward, and I had to shield my own eyes against the bright intrusion. Then the screen darkened, and Travis was staring at a bleak landscape of reds and blacks. He moved the joystick, the screen panning around, and it became apparent that he was in a cave. Travis praised the graphics, walking up to the wall and inspecting the textures. I had to admit, it was very impressive. The renderings were far beyond anything the cabinet or the screen should have been capable of. For a second, I could swear the pictures on the console were real-time. The cave walls were made of dark stone with veins of red that wound through them in arteries. The walls pulsated and moved oddly, and when he turned, there was a dim light coming from the end of the tunnel behind him. Shapes moved in that light, strangely proportioned shapes, and Travis seemed hesitant to go in that direction. After a few seconds of half-heartedly looking around, though, he discovered that this was the only route and moved his character down the tunnel. Kind of basic for a game with such well-defined graphics, but whatever, Travis grumbled as he moved up the pulsating tunnel, viewing the weird rocks around him. I heard him gasp when the tunnel roof gave way to the sky, and my own breath stuck in my throat at the sight. The sky was a deep red, the red of heart's blood, and as he took it all in, I could see bodies falling from it ceaselessly. They fell close, they fell far away, and the ones that fell close to the cave splattered on the ground with sickening realism. Travis jumped back, startled as the realistic gore splattered across the ground, and I heard him use a word that would have definitely got us demonetized if I wasn't going to edit it out later. I reached for my earbuds as a family lumbered past on their way to the bathroom, the squelching making my stomach flip over a little as it erupted again and again. I didn't want anyone to hear these sounds. Hell, I didn't want to listen to these sounds when it came right down to it. As I slipped my earbuds in, I heard Travis mumbling about the level of gore as a body landed a few feet from him and burst like an overripe fruit. He seemed more intrigued than angry, though. Then, as Travis watched the body, it got up. Its limbs popped grotesquely back into place, and the naked humanoid, bald and sexless, got up and stumbled away from the site of its landing. It ignored Travis, stumbling across the dark sand that covered the ground. I could hear Travis breathing hard as he watched, and after some hesitation, he followed it. It stumbled across the sand, jumping as the hot sand burned its feet, and as it traveled away from the cave, Travis could see it joining groups of other battered bodies. They didn't speak. They grouped out of pure instinct and shuffled along as the black sand gave way to sluggish rivers of living fire. The group seemed to shy away from the fire, and I really couldn't blame them. Something seemed to be moving within the flames, and the group of bodies seemed to know that it was something that wanted to hurt them. Travis followed them, but never joined their group. He seemed to understand that these skittish creatures, humans or not, would be a target for whatever lived here, and their group would attract a lot of attention. As if to prove that point, one of them strayed a little too close to the fire and was ensnared by an arm of living flame that dragged it into the fiery river. The group looked after him, marking his departure, but they neither mourned him or slowed. They kept moving, and I could see other groups moving similarly as Travis used the joystick to look around. "What in the hell is going on with this game?" Travis asked as he followed the group at a safe distance. Am I supposed to follow them? Am I supposed to strike out on my own? I don't get the point here. He decided to follow them, despite their lack of direction, and as they neared a field of sharp black grass, I saw a creature jump out to challenge them. He was average height, his skin a deep maroon, and somehow he reminded me of the shopkeeper at the arcade. He was as wide as he was tall, and he looked at the group with a broad smile on his face. It was a distinctly gobble-you-up sort of smile. It spoke to them in a strange language, completely ignoring Travis as he moved in for a closer look, and some of the creatures stepped forward hesitantly to stand near him. The rest stood their ground, unsure of the stranger or whatever he was offering. It didn't matter. The nets came flying from the grass then, and the creatures yelled in a very human way as they were captured. Some tried to flee, others were resigned to their fate, but none of them tried to fight back. They were sheep, and soon they would be rounded up and taken to wherever it was they were bound. They made piteous noises as the nets fell over them, which seemed to push Travis to action. Travis rushed at the creatures, yelling at them to get the hell away, but since he possessed no weapons, he attempted to run his body into them and stop them from taking the struggling humanoids. He bumped the creatures, foundering against them, and the creatures took no more notice of him than an ant. They had the group rounded up in no time, and when they walked into the grass with their prize, Travis followed them into that sea of blackness. Maybe I'm supposed to follow them, he said, his voice a little frantic. Maybe that's my goal? He moved into the grass like a blind man, losing the creatures almost at once. When he came out, he was alone in a dark world of black sand and endless miles. He traveled into the emptiness, unsure of where he was going. He moved aimlessly, the hellscape never changing, and the falling bodies never ceasing. Travis didn't follow them anymore, though. He seemed to think it was pointless, and as he moved deeper in, I could hear his breathing becoming frantic and unsure. The game was presenting him nothing but a vast world to explore, but he seemed unable to interact with it or alter it. There were no trees to punch, no shelters to make, no goals to accomplish, and the only constant seemed to be the moans of the falling bodies or the distant screams of the unseen. The screams would erupt distantly, sending Travis turning frantically in that direction, before returning to his chosen path. He had seen no one but the creatures and the humanoids they hunted, and he was becoming a little paranoid of the big open landscape. Travis began his journey into emptiness with some commentary on the landscape, the graphics, and the game's strangeness. The farther he went into the wasteland, the more addled he seemed to become. He talked less to the audience and more to himself. At first it was just idle talk, wondering if he was going the right way or not, but slowly his speech began to descend into mumbling. The screams were starting to get to him, and I was worried that he might be losing it as his camera panned around for what felt like the 1,000th time. I fast-forwarded a little bit. His trip through the wasteland made up almost 4 hours of the total video. When he had stopped in the desert, staring at a fixed point for several minutes, I started the video and returned to his heavy, labored breathing as he stared into the distance. He sounded ragged, as though he had been slogging for hours for real, and he just stared into the distance for no reason, intent on something. Suddenly he ran towards whatever he was seeing. The camera footage was secondhand, and I leaned in as the McDonald's crowd bustled around me, trying to see what he was seeing. Whatever it was had excited him. Whatever it was had piqued his curiosity. He ran like a man possessed, stumbling in the game as he made his way over the shifting sands towards whatever lay beyond. When the first tree of the grove came into view, I thought I knew what he had seen. When I saw what was hanging from the tree, I wondered why he was in such a hurry to get to them. The grove of dark and twisted trees came looming up from the spinning air. They weren't tall, maybe 8 feet, but each of them bore a length of rope that swung from its branches. At the end of each rope was a sexless humanoid. As Travis got close, I could see the purple bruises around their necks and the boneless way they hung from the dead trees. The grove was nothing but these grotesque wind chimes, and Travis seemed less eager as he walked into it. When the first one started screaming, I cried out right along with Travis. It came as a sudden eruption in my right ear, and my sudden yelp made a couple across from me frown and look at me oddly. I apologized, turning back to the video to see Travis studying the poor creature as it twisted on the noose. It grabbed at him, speaking in a strange language that might have been English once. It held its arms out to him, pleading for relief, or for release, or something, and Travis backed away before bolting. The forest came alive then, the tortured screams and shaking trees erupting into a cacophony and fury, and Travis began to run frantically amidst the swinging horrors. He fell suddenly, tripping over a root, and when he looked up, I heard him sob audibly as his eyes fell on a single, withered humanoid. It might have once been female, but as it was, its chest was flat, its crotch smooth, and its head hairless and lumpy. As it lifted its searching, begging face to him, I could see a single half-moon scar on its cheek. She screamed and wailed just as the others had, but there was a deep longing for release in her eyes. She begged him with her eyes, cried at him with her wailing mouth, and Travis could do nothing but stare at her as she wailed into the void. "Mom?" he breathed, his voice shaky. Travis had lost his mom last year to cancer. I had known her all my life. She had made Travis and I snacks after school, drove us places in our teens, and Travis had always been so close with her that she became like a second mother to me. How many times had I seen that scar on her cheek and wondered how she'd gotten it? Her face was still as sunken as it had been in the hospital as she lay dying, and as that screaming face stared back at Travis, I saw him snap like an over-tightened guitar string. His fists came up, and he slammed them into the screen. The cabinet shook, the image shivering, but Travis was far from satisfied. He slammed his fists, he kicked his booted feet, and he screamed like a wild man as the cabinet jerked and bent under his assault. How had I not heard him? How had I been feet away, having the time of my life, while my best friend had gone through the worst trauma of his? How had I not heard him screaming? How had I not heard his fury? As the cabinet sparked and broke, I could hear him screaming the same thing again and again, and it broke my heart to hear the pain in it. "Mom! Mom! Mom! Mom!" The door swung open, and the arcade owner screamed at him, wanting to know what he was doing. Travis rushed the man, his smile now an angry gnash of teeth, and shoved him out of the way as he made a break for the back room. He turned to look at the store owner, and for just a moment, I could see the faces of those creatures that had captured the humanoids. His gnash of teeth looked like the beast's frozen grin, and I could almost hear Travis coming to the same conclusion. He bolted for the back door, and I saw him run out into the dingy alley. He looked around frantically, people on the street staring in mistrust, before taking a left turn and heading in the opposite direction we had come. He ran up the streets of Tamanaru, a stranger in a strange land, and the people on the street gave him a wide berth. He was frantic, moving like a wild animal, and when he stopped suddenly, I leaned in close to see what he was looking at. He stared, seeming to stare at his reflection in the window across the street, and the people diverted around him as he just sat there, staring. I could see his small reflection in the glass, and he looked haggard, crazed even, but his face was filled with that unhinged understanding that you sometimes see in the mentally ill. "Mom," he whispered, and without warning, he rushed across the street with the blare of car horns following him. He ran up the street, never slowing, and when he came to a familiar train station, I wondered what he meant to do. He kept calling for his mother, chasing her ghost or something else that only he could see, as people moved out of his way like he might be contagious. He ran through the platform, the rustic wooden benches looking spooky in the near dark, and the people in the loading area cried out as he jumped down onto the track. I wanted to turn away, fearing what would happen next, but I owed it to him to see his end. The train came rolling up, blowing its whistle. He ran towards it, shouting her name. "Mom! Mom!" The train whistle blared, and the people on the platform screamed, "Mom! Mom!" The train lights rolled in close, a blinding corona of light in the eyes of the camera. "Mom!" Everything went white, and then suddenly dark as the video ended. I sat back, stunned, unsure of what I had seen or what I should do. My best friend was dead, a victim of this game that I still don't understand. I watched it secondhand, so maybe it doesn't have the same effect on me, but that's little comfort in the face of my friend's violent departure from life. I have nothing now. I haven't just lost my friend, I've lost my job and my means of returning home. Travis had our tickets in his bag. He had our hotel keys in his pocket. And I'm sitting on the sidewalk of the closed McDonald's now, unsure how to proceed. I don't know what Travis saw in his last minutes of life, but I pray it wasn't his shrieking mother that hung from the skeletal tree of that damned game. All I can do is tell my story and hope that some of you will have answers. All I can do is warn you not to play this game, as enticing as it may seem. Travis would want his death to mean something. He would want his sacrifice to be more than just another Let's Play or a creepypasta. I pray that if the land in that game is real, Travis didn't become one of those falling things that came from the sky. If there is a God, I pray that he took him somewhere better. I pulled up in front of the shop and had to recheck my directions. It was a dingy little hole-in-the-wall place between a Dollar General and a computer repair shop. It looked like it had just existed here since the creation of the first VHS tape. The windows were covered in thick yellow paper, and the outside was caked with a film of old dirt. The sign on the door read "Open," but it was barely visible through the dirty windows. There was no way this place was what I wanted. When I was a kid, I remember watching a show called Children of Man. As a kid, the premise of the show appealed to me. The show was all about kids living on an island in the Pacific, trying to survive day-to-day trials. The producers had gotten about 40 kids from all over America, ages 10 to 12, and dropped them off with supplies and instructions on how to survive. The host, Chris Mansworth, was a survival expert, and he would create challenges every day for the kids to complete. There were 4 teams of 10 kids, and the winner of each challenge got something cool for their area of the village. I watched the show religiously as a kid. Every Saturday night, right after The Simpsons, the show would come on, and I would be enthralled. I always imagined that I was on the island with them, surviving day to day. The challenges were really neat, too. They had kids gut and clean their own meat, dig wells by hand, build rafts for raft races, and make aqueducts so their village could have running water. It was a neat idea, but after 8 episodes, the show just kind of stopped. No new episodes came out, and the station never gave a reason. This was before the internet, so there was no way to check on updates online. so the show slipped off into obscurity, and my 10-year-old self just kind of forgot about it. I remembered the show again a few years ago, when Mom sent me a box of stuff from the attic. There were a couple of old VHS tapes in there, and between Batman, the animated series, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, were 8 tapes with handwritten labels that read Children of Men. We had a VHS recorder when I was a kid, and I can remember recording my favorite shows to watch later. I was excited to get to see the old show again, the memories flooding back as I started looking for the VHS player amongst the tapes in the box. There wasn't one, but a quick trip to Goodwill and $15, and I had a gently used VCR hooked up to my TV. I watched all 8 episodes back to back and fell in love with the show all over again. I remembered the kids I liked. Robert and Catherine were my favorites, but many of the kids had also been given a lot of screen time, and it was hard not to like them too. As I watched, I found myself wanting to see how the show ended, over and over again. As I watched the show, I began to notice something a little darker under the surface too, something I hadn't noticed as a kid. The village was divided into 4 teams: green snakes, bluebirds, red foxes, and brown mice. The teams had been divided up by background mostly, and it seemed very divisive to me as an adult. The green snakes did most of the hunting for the village, a lot of their kids having a rural background, while the brown mice did most of the farming and gathering because they came from a farm background. The red foxes were in charge of construction and upkeep. They were the smart kids, and they worked with the bluebirds, who were in charge of food management and cooking the meals. Every team had a representative who sat on a council. Robert was for the green snakes, Catherine for the bluebirds, Marco for the red foxes, and Shireen for the brown mice. As the show went on, it became very apparent that Robert didn't trust Marco, and with good reason. Marco and Shireen had formed a kind of alliance on their own, most of it because Marco bullied her into doing what he wanted. Robert and Catherine set up their own alliance, and Robert started holding out food to sway Shireen's decision. The village needed food, and Robert pointed out that he and Catherine were the ones providing it. Robert and Shireen wanted a fair split for everyone, but Marco tried to split them into class systems that would put his foxes at a higher tier. Robert didn't like that, and it became very clear that if Chris hadn't been there would have been a lot more fighting. Robert was a big 12-year-old, a stocky bruiser who won battles with his fists most of the time, and Chris had to separate him and Marco on more than one occasion. Marco was smaller, but definitely had charisma. He had most of the mice and all of the foxes on his side, and I wasn't sure how I missed all of this tension as a kid. It all came to a head on episode 6. Marco was caught hoarding food in the Red Fox village. It wasn't just food that the other teams had been bringing in either. He had been taking the comfort foods from the canteen the brown mice ran for the village and storing them in his hut. Robert discovered this and took Marco prisoner, demanding that he be placed on trial. The whole village was in an uproar, but Marco agreed to be confined to a central cabin until the council could rule on his trial. Chris was setting the whole trial up as an episode 8 for the viewers. At the end of episode 8, the council found Marco guilty, and the episode was ended with a lot of shaky camera work and the red foxes storming the podium where Marco was seated. That was how the show had ended. The little bell chimed overhead as I stepped into the tiny place. The store looked like a throwback. Sharp-looking rickety shelves that were covered in plastic VHS boxes and dust. The shelves held VHS tapes, Betamax, and DVD cases that were arranged neatly amongst the filth and dust. A quick look showed that they were all arranged alphabetically, like an ancient library of some sort. The shelves fronted onto a glass display case that held murky wonders within. On the counter was a TV, an ashtray stacked with old butts, and a greasy store clerk who smiled at me as I approached. "You the one who called about the tape?" he asked, showing a mouthful of stained teeth as he smiled. I had searched for months on my own. I had taken to the internet in an attempt to find something, anything that would give me some closure. Wikipedia told me that only 8 episodes were aired, but that 12 had been intended. I dug deeper and began to see that the show was a mystery all its own. The list of children that had been on the show was woefully incomplete. Marco and Robert were there, so were Catherine and Shireen, and Chris was there as the host, but none of the other children were named. No one except Chris Mansworth had gone on to do anything after the show, and his only contribution was his death a few months later. His Wikipedia said that he had committed suicide in his hotel room, and foul play was not suspected. As for the last 4 episodes of Children of Man, however, there was no mention. So I took to the usual online sleuths, Reddit, 4chan, TV message boards, but no one seemed to have the answer. Most people had never even heard of Children of Man, and the ones that had were more interested in my copies than the last 4 episodes. Apparently the episodes were never compiled or released for purchase, and the only means by which you could still see them were on VHS tapes like mine. I had several offers for them. One guy wanted to give me $500 per tape, but I declined and told him I'd post copies of the tapes for free if they wanted. That's how I met Charleston Hammer 462. He was a user on the hometown board of Reddit. He saw my post and the posted videos and got in contact with me about the place I was currently in. Heard you were looking for a certain tape. In my line of work, when you're looking for something, you go talk to Reggie. He owns a shop in Burlington, South Carolina called Video Time Capsule. If you need a banned episode of a 70s drama or a never-aired documentary from the 60s, you talk to Reggie. I read the message a few times before responding. Thanks, Charleston, but these episodes aren't just unaired. They're unknown. No one has ever seen them. I don't even know if they exist. And the store you're talking about is 400 miles away. When I hit send on the message, I figured I'd never hear from him again. It took him an hour to respond, but he got back with me. What you're after is very rare. I used to watch Children of Man myself when I was younger. It ended so abruptly that it's been an internet mystery since the net was just message boards and wells. I didn't learn about the last 4 episodes, though, until I met Reggie at TVCon. We got to talking about old TV shows, and after a few drinks, he told me he had the last 4 episodes of Children of Men. I perked up. Have you seen them? That response took a little longer. I have. It's some pretty different stuff. I won't ruin it for you, but if you value the way you remember the show, don't watch it. There's a reason these episodes never made it to air. Here's the number to the store. If it's late, call him anyway. Reggie keeps weird hours, and sometimes that store's open 24 hours a day. He's an eccentric dude, don't doubt, but he has what you're looking for. The number was at the bottom of the message. Yeah, I said, no longer quite sure what I was doing here. Yeah, I called about the complete series of Children of Men. He nodded, reached under the counter, and slapped a plain white case onto it. All 8 episodes, recorded as aired, he said, studying me. I frowned. I'm after the last 4 episodes. His piggy eyes glinted behind the grease-smeared glasses. There were only 8 episodes aired. And you told me you had the other 4 that never aired. He smiled, and it did ghastly things to his porcine face. Had to make sure. Come to the back. And with that, he disappeared behind the curtain into the back room. I walked around, hesitating for a moment as I touched the curtain, and followed him. I'd come 400 miles, might as well go 5 feet into hell. The phone rang 6 times. I was just about to hang up when someone answered and spoke through a mouthful of food. I didn't understand him, but once he'd swallowed whatever he'd had in his mouth, he tried again. Video Time Capsule, where your memories are always on sale. What a tagline. Yes, I'm looking for something specific. The sound of something being stuffed into the speaker's mouth and chewed loudly assaulted my ears as he continued. Aren't they all? What you looking for? Clearly, customer service was not his strong suit. Episodes 9 through 12 of Children of Man. I heard something hit the floor, and the speaker cursed loudly. Yeah, you must be mistaken. There are only 8 episodes of Children of Man. Look, I said a little hotly, I was told that you have things that no one else does. I want to see those episodes. I don't even want to buy them. I was just told that you have them in your possession. Is there any way that I can just... $500, the voice returned, and the tone was not to be bargained with. In cash, before I will even let you see them. I agreed, despite the outrageous price, and now I was here in the grungy shop, preparing to go into the back. The back was worse than the front. DVDs and VHS tapes were stacked into teetering piles. The back room was lit by only a few dingy overheads, and I could see an old TV casting its glow from the back. The floor was riddled with trash, and I swear you could hear the mice scampering around to get out of my way. What sort of videos could you find in here? Would this place give me anything but heartbreak? This seemed like the setup for 1,000 scary stories, and I suddenly didn't want to see these mysterious artifacts. But like anyone else who comes to find things that they want, I needed to see them. Reggie was waiting by the TV. He had an ancient set that looked very similar to the one my parents had owned. On top of it was a VHS DVD combo player that had a set of rabbit ears stuck out of it like a weather vane. There was a wooden chair in front of it with a little blue pad on it. Reggie held up a hand. $500, he said. I reached into my pocket, but I paused. How do I know it's authentic? Look, I could get into a lot of trouble for even owning this, okay? You think guys who possess child porn go to prison for a long time? This would put me under the prison for life. If you want to see those episodes, then I need the money. Are we doing business or what? I handed him the money, and he popped the cassette tape in and walked away. Not joining me, I asked. Not for another $500, kid. I heard the curtains rustle, and the show began. Episode 9 gave us a recap of the trial, and then the storming of the stage. When the show started, I noticed a distinct lapse in the film quality. Whoever was operating the camera was just shorter than the usual crew members, and they seemed barely able to lift the heavy rig. Finally, the camera had Robert in frame, and he began to fill us in on what was happening in the village. It's been about 3 days since Marco's trial and his escape. Since then, Fox Village has been separated from our village. They took most of the brown mice with them, and now they're trying to raid us every night for food. Something's going on over there. We heard shouts this morning, and at that point, the shouts got louder, and Robert ran off screen as the camera tried to follow him. We came to the edge of Red Fox Village. Many of the huts that were once on the verge had been burnt out, making a kind of barricade between them and the rest of the village. Many voices were cheering as something swung from the tree. At first, I thought it was just an effigy, a dummy maybe, but then suddenly I realized it was Shireen. She hung like a grotesque wind chime in the space between the villages, and Robert shouted for Marco to stop being a coward and come out. Some of the kids were crying, but everyone on the other side cheered and shouted, "Traitor!" or "Faithless!" at the swinging body of Shireen. I sat glued to the TV, unsure if any of this was even real. It was night when the next recording resumed. It seemed that whoever was running the camera wanted us to see a raid. The night vision on the camera showed kids with torches fighting other kids who were leaving their storehouse in a hurry. The kids with torches hacked at them with machetes, blood flying as they connected, and some of them dropped as they were stabbed or hacked to pieces by the blades of the other children. The rest of the episode was mostly uneventful. Lots of shaky cam, lots of crying, and at one point someone dropped it and didn't pick it up again for several minutes. As the episode ended, I was left looking at my own stark face looking back at me. What had I just watched? There was no way this could be the same show. Things had gone very Lord of the Flies in the village, and as the 10th episode started, I wasn't sure what to expect. Episode 10 started without preamble. There was no recap, no theme music, and the footage looked unedited. We see a much more professional camera crew, and Chris Mansworth trying to bring some order back to the island. They're coming up through the shallows, Chris and about 10 adults, coming up in the dark towards the village. Chris was talking about how it had all gotten so out of hand, and how he was going to try to rescue the kids. As they came into the seemingly empty village, Chris cupped his hands and began to shout at the empty huts. He told them that the game was over, and that it was time they went home. He told them that there was a boat that would take them home, but there was still no response. He moved deeper into the collection of straw huts, the fires burning low around him, and that was when they struck. Kids with spears, kids with machetes, came screaming out of the darkness, and the cameramen backpedaled furiously as the adults were completely taken by surprise. Blood flew, legs were sawed off as pint-sized pygmies hacked and chopped, and Chris Mansworth was buried under a pile of children as he screamed and flailed. As the cameraman tripped and went down, we see the shadow of a child standing over him as the spear comes down as well. The episode ended very abruptly. I was speechless. What the hell had happened to them? These were kids that had been doing challenges and making friends. The rivalry between Robert and Marco had always been the most serious part of the show, but now they had devolved into savagery. The 11th episode was about 10 minutes long. It opened on a stationary camera shot of the same space where they had held the trial. Marco was on his knees before the camera, and he looked bad. His left eye was a puffy mass of bruised tissue. His left ear was a bleeding stump. His nose looked to be cut jaggedly. He was weeping silently, and his tears were thick and bloody. Robert stood behind him. He had always worn a white football jersey in every episode I'd seen him in, but the garment was stained red and brown now. He bled from several places on his chest, and when he raised his machete, it was with obvious pain. This morning, before the sun had risen, this dog attempted to attack our village. He violated the rules of war as agreed upon by he and I. We agreed to a battle between our two villages at dawn. This snake tried to attack us in the night and lost. Thus his village is forfeit. As the winner, I sentence him to death. Please, Robert, Mansworth said, his voice off screen. The show's over. We can all go home now, back to your parents. It doesn't have to end like this. As Marco cried his terrible tears, Robert looked at Chris off screen and turned back to his enemy. The show is over. This is our home now. He brought the machete down. Marco cried out and fell face first onto the ground. Robert fell on him, hitting him with the machete again and again. Blood sprayed from the struggling child, and when Robert looked back at the camera, his face was spattered with gore. He reached out, and the camera went off abruptly. The last episode was only a few minutes. It started with a shaky cam journey through the jungle. The runner was being pursued. I could hear the footsteps behind him. As the runner got to the shore, he jumped onto something and pushed it into the water. The wooden deck of a boat came into view, and as he drifted out, I could hear oars working in the water. He sat the camera on the seat as he rowed, and the faces of children could be seen in the surrounding jungle. Then, everything went dark. The tape clicked, and the TV went back to static. I left it in the VCR and stumbled out of the back room. Reggie was sitting behind the counter and looked up at me with something like sympathy. He held something back towards me, and I saw it was my money. I shook my head and stepped away from him. I had bought a ticket, and I had paid the price. You okay? Yeah. So, what happened to the kids? They just left them there? Reggie shrugged. Coast Guard picked up Mansworth about 2 days later. He was drifting in the ocean and looked extremely rattled. He wouldn't tell them how he had gotten out there or where he had been. When he got back, he gave the tapes to the studio, and the next time anyone saw him, he was dead. And the kids? The studio never pursued the show, never sold the aired episodes. They never even tried to air what Chris had brought back. They just made the whole thing disappear. I suppose there's an island out there full of kids who wanted to be on a TV show and just never came back. Their parents were likely told there had been an accident or something. The whole thing was hushed up, and eventually people forgot. You'll forget one day too, he added, as though he thought it might help. As I lay in bed now, trying to forget the horrible things I saw, I hope I do forget, but I doubt I ever will. So if you ever find an island out in the Pacific, maybe one full of locals that look just a little not right, turn your boat back out of sight. Those natives are not friendly. Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me for tonight's story. I hope you enjoyed Children of Men. It was a lot of fun to write, and it was my first delve into that classic TV horror trope. Before we go, let's go ahead and thank our sponsors. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to become one of our contributors, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can have your name read out at the end of every video and every TikTok. If you're thinking you might like some more tiers, I'm working on some right now. Maybe doing something a little special coming up, so keep a lookout for that. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening. There were 4 of us when we broke into the Megaplex. There was Ralph, better known as Razorgore on YouTube, and Dale, better known as Drakesong. The two of them often do head-to-head videos on YouTube, as well as Let's Plays and other game content where they played the latest video games and titles. Jeremy, Kyle, and I were just the editing team, but we appeared on the channel often enough to be recognized. I was operating the camera that night as we came up to the back door of the Megaplex, ducking under the police tape. What's up, Gorehounds? Tonight we have something special for you, Ralph said, trying to keep his voice pitched low and failing. As some of you may know, the Megaplex in our area was recently closed under some pretty creepy circumstances. Ralph pulled a goofy-looking face that was probably supposed to be creepy as he looked into the camera. Dale tried to stay in the shot, looking unimpressed and striving for that too cool for this look. Kyle and Jeremy stood outside the camera, Jeremy waiting for his cue and Kyle looking around nervously. Ralph had talked us into this, and all of us were having second thoughts now that we were here. The payoff would be spectacular, but the risks would definitely be high. For those of you who don't know, Dale said, Last week, an unknown man came in for the midnight showing of Silence of the Lambs and killed 8 patrons in the theater. Many of the others escaped, but when the cops burst in, he was nowhere to be found. The theater has been closed for 2 weeks now, with no sign of the murderer, so we figured it's the perfect place to break into and play some Dead by Daylight, maybe some Friday the 13th, as we all sit in the creepy theater, isolated in the darkness. We kept saying break in because it sounded more dramatic. In reality, Jeremy worked for the Megaplex as an assistant manager, and he had keys. I kept the camera on Ralph and Dale as Jeremy approached the employee entrance with the crowbar, so the camera could easily see him as he passed. After some grunting and exertion off screen, while Ralph and Dale hyped up the stream, Jeremy slid the key into the lock and unlocked it with one quick, smooth twist. He gave a mighty strain and pretended to wrench the door open as he turned the handle. I turned to look at the door as it came flying open, and the two congratulated him as we proceeded into the dark back room of the Megaplex. I had all 4 of our laptops in a bag around my back, and I tried not to bump them together as we walked inside. I would sit in the booth and monitor the stream, collecting the video and audio from the other sessions, and piece them together into something cool that we could post on our channels next week. The creepy ambience and gameplay would play well together. It would ensure that we had something awesome for maximum viewership. I could also monitor them from the central projection hub in case something went wrong. The theater was dark, the emergency exit signs glaring garishly at us as we walked through the snack bar and into the common area. The Megaplex had 12 different theaters and would allow each of us to sit in a different one without even having to leave our fingerprints in the theater that was also a crime scene. We had toyed with the idea of having all of them sit in there, basking in the atmosphere of death as they played killers and victims. But the idea of accidentally leaving evidence behind to incriminate ourselves was particularly unappealing. We were already taking a huge risk by doing this. Mitigating risk from herein was important. "Okay, we're going to set up now," Ralph said to the camera as he stood near the entrance to the theater hallway. "See you on the other side, gorehounds," he intoned. I switched off the camera and put down the bag as I handed out the controllers. "Okay, here's your controllers. Take any theater but 7. Jeremy, show me which one of these keys gets me in the booth again." Jeremy flipped through them until he found a longish silver one, handing it to me. "This one, and the one next to it will get you into the projection cage. You know what you're doing up there, right?" he asked for the 1,000th time. "Hook the HDMI cables from the laptop to the projector. It's not rocket surgery, dude." "Please, for the love of God, don't unhook anything that's already hooked up to the projectors. We're playing a pretty dangerous game here already, and I don't want anyone questioning why there are suddenly wires unplugged." "I think I can handle it, Jeremy. Now you guys go and get set up so we can get started." They went towards the theater, and I went towards the projection booth. 30 minutes later, we were ready to start streaming. The software on each laptop was easy to set up, and hooking the computers to the projector was easy. Each of their audio feeds let me hear what they were saying, and let them communicate with each other through the game software. They had taken theaters 5, 6, 8, and 9, leaving theater 7 empty between them. I couldn't help but glance down into the dark theater as I worked, my eyes straying to it ever so often. The lurid red exit signs were the only light in theater 7, casting the police tape and seats in an eerie crimson glow. I cut the screens on for 5, 6, 8, and 9, seeing the theaters light up as the screens flickered to life. When the screen for 7 came on too, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced out the little window that gave me a bird's eye view of the theater, and nearly dropped the laptop I'd been about to move. From my vantage point, I had a great view of the large black shape standing frozen in front of the screen. I backed away shakily, startled by the sudden appearance of the gangly shape, and bumped into the desk as I stumbled away from the frightening sight. I stood, breathing hard, as my mind raced and my brain ran over 1,000 different scenarios. Was it the killer? A cop doing some late-night investigation? A janitor? They weren't moving, so I had probably startled them as bad as they'd startled me. What if it was the killer? They had said they'd never left, hadn't they? My mind kept plodding over that little nugget as I stood motionless and felt my guts writhing in terror. I needed to get the audio feeds hooked up so I could warn them. I needed to call their cell phones so they could run. I needed to do something other than just stand here in abject terror, but that seemed to be all I was capable of doing. When he continued to stand motionless, however, I felt my fear ebb some and took another look. I realized my mistake pretty quick. The coat had clearly been left over a chair or something. The longer I looked at it, the more details became apparent, and the stranger it became that I couldn't see the arms or legs sticking out of it. I laughed when I realized I was frozen in fear by someone's leftover coat, and chalked it up to the creepy ambience of this abandoned theater. I was too jumpy. I had to keep my head in the game. I got back to work. "Mic 1, check," I asked, sitting down and testing the setup. "Check," said Ralph. I saw a little light come on in the seating area as his controller came on. "Mic 2, check." "Check," said Dale. "Mic 3, check." Nothing. "Mic 3, check," I asked, looking out into Theater 8. I didn't see anyone sitting in the dark rows of seats and started glancing around to see where Jeremy was. The screen was a solid, staticky white that covered the whole theater in a bright carpet of light. By that light, I could see nothing but an empty theater. This inevitably led my eyes over to Theater 7, and I had to double-take when I noticed something was amiss. I stood up, squinting at the chair someone had left on the little platform in front of the screen. The chair was bare now, just a silhouette behind the white screen. The coat was gone. "Sorry, Mic 3 here. I had to go to the bathroom." The coat had been there. I knew I had seen it. The ragged old coat had been sitting on a chair in front of the screen, a chair that was now empty. The hood had been up, making me think that someone had been inside it, the arms dangling out like empty scarecrows, and now it was just gone. The theater was still empty. I could see it illuminated by the screen, but the coat had vanished. "Hey, are you there? Control, come back." I shook it off and went back to my setup. "Check. Mic 4, check." "Check and check," Kyle said. I got back to the job at hand. I'd ponder that old coat and its escape act later. I would ponder that old coat a lot more than that in the coming days. I lined up their cameras so their fans could see and hear them, and then we officially started the stream. Our last stream, as it happens. "What's up, Gorehounds? I'm joined by Drake Song from channel Dragonhorn, as well as Kyle and Jeremy, regulars on the show. We're going to be playing some Dead by Daylight in the bowels of the Murder Megaplex." His head was little more than a ghostly floating specter as the camera picked it up and made him look a little ghoulish in the dim light. The screen became black as the game started. I watched as they rolled into the selection menu, the game divvying up teams and assigning the killer. I let my mind wander a bit as I monitored the stream. The boys were enjoying themselves, yelling and screaming whenever the killer would sneak up on them. They had played 3 games, Jeremy taking the killer role twice, when someone in the comments started trying to get my attention. This was pretty typical behavior. Most of these guys were attention whores, and they wanted to make the highlight reel at the end of the video where we showed great comments or funny moments. This guy, despite the ridicule he was getting from the others in the comments section, was not letting up, and that drew my attention. "There's a shadow behind Kyle," he said. Then a few minutes later, "Seriously, someone is sneaking up behind Kyle." 5 seconds after that, he posted, "Someone get Kyle's attention. Someone is coming up behind him." I looked at the camera feed, but saw nothing besides Kyle's face lit by the ghostly light of the movie screen. The game was the kind that favored a very muted color palette, and it had bathed the theater in a murky tone. I looked back to chat and saw that the guy was still yelling about someone coming up behind Kyle, telling him to watch out. I looked back at the feed and nearly fell out of my chair as a momentary flash of lightning in the game lit up the whole theater. I had seen someone poised behind him for a bare second, a black-clad figure in a long, ratty coat that I remembered all too well. I keyed up Kyle's mic and told him to watch out, but he didn't move. Instead, he just continued to look at the screen with that same frozen look of concentration he had been wearing all night. Kyle had always had this intense look when he gamed, his expression somewhere between concentration and catatonia. I could see the silhouette of the man behind him, but it too was stationary and unmoving. When his feed cut out abruptly, I realized he'd been frozen for about 5 minutes. I looked out into the theater and could see Kyle still sitting there, head bent a little. His character was standing still. Ralph strolled by with the Reaper and killed him, dropping him with an easy swipe of his sickle. "Oh, tough break, Kyle. You hit a lag spike or something?" Kyle said nothing. I glanced out at the theater Ralph was in and saw that he was alone in the murky blackness. Ditto for Jeremy, and ditto for Dale. I assumed that the figure was still in the theater with Kyle, so maybe I had time to warn the others. It occurred to me that this might all be an elaborate prank, but surely they would have told me if it were, right? Otherwise, I might call the cops, which would draw attention to our stream and cause us to have to leave. I keyed up Ralph's mic so the others wouldn't hear me. "Ralph, we've got a problem." "What's up, homie?" Ralph asked. and I could hear the theater speakers booming in the background. Something's going on. There's someone in the theater with Kyle, and now he won't respond. He hasn't moved his character, and I can't raise him on the headset. I think something's happened to him, but I need you to tell me if this is some kind of prank. Ralph was quiet for a second before chuckling kind of weirdly. I don't have the slightest idea what you're talking about, homie, but if you're trying to run a prank here, it's not funny. It's creepy enough in this theater all by itself. I don't need to think about some creeper roaming around in the dark. Look, I'm telling you, this looks like... But then I looked out into his theater and I felt my next words stolen from me. Someone was standing in the aisle a few feet from Ralph's seat. Someone who was holding a crowbar that was dripping wetly. "Ralph, behind you!" I yelled, but by the time he turned, it was too late. Ralph cringed against the seat in front of him as the hooded figure lunged with the upraised tool. I watched as his controller spilled to the floor, the assailant smashing him across the face with the dripping instrument. He rode him to the ground, Ralph looking dazed as he fell. The tool came up with each swing in a theatrical, horror movie fashion, sending out sprays of blood that coated the seats. The figure rose once he'd finished, and I could almost feel his eyes on me as he looked up to the projection booth. I backstepped to the computer and keyed up the other two mics. "Dale, Jeremy, you guys need to come to the projection booth right now." "Why?" Dale asked. Someone just killed Ralph." "What?" Jeremy asked, and I could hear him standing up. "He beat him to death with a crowbar. We need to get the hell out of here, right now." "Agreed. Dale, you and I should head for the emergency exit in the theater a while." But there was a sound like someone tripping over carpet. I heard Jeremy's mic go dead, and a quick look showed me his feet being dragged behind a row of seats. I heard wind passing by Dale's mic as he ran for the exit. I could hear him hyperventilating a little, and as I watched, I could see him running for the glowing exit signs. I could also see the figure step out in front of him from a row of seats and bash him with the crowbar, knocking him sideways into the other row of seats. I backed away from the window then, starting to hyperventilate myself. This was crazy. How could they have gotten Dale and Jeremy at the same time? Was there more than one killer? How had they gotten this far? Had they been waiting for us this whole time? I shook myself out of my daze and decided that I needed to go. I looked at the equipment on the table and decided to leave it pretty quick. It would slow me down, and who really cared if the police found it? I was getting ready to report this the second I got outside anyway. I glanced through the projection hole one last time, checking to see if anyone was in the theater, and finding no one below. That was when something slammed into the projection room door, and I fell on my ass. I scuttled back against the wall, eyes glued to the door that was being violently rammed from the other side. Whatever it was slammed into the door a few more times before it rattled the handle and found it locked. I was suddenly glad I'd remembered to lock it, and I patted my pocket for my phone. I decided to go ahead and call the police. They could book me for trespassing right after they saved my life. It wasn't until I'd patted myself down a half a dozen times that I remembered I'd left it on the table next to the laptop. That was also when I realized that the banging had stopped. I crept on hands and knees towards the desk, praying the phone hadn't fallen. The silence was deafening in the wake of the explosive pounding. I kept glancing at the door as I crawled, expecting that any minute the door would burst open. I was afraid to look over the edge of the table, fumbling in vain as I tried to find my phone. That's when I heard a truly chilling noise, the last noise I ever expected to hear. The sound of keys being thrust into the lock, and the door being opened with a simple turn of the knob. I sat huddled beneath the table as a hooded figure wandered into the office. He was tall, his face hidden under the blackness of that dark covering, and his feet echoed off the floor as he stalked towards me. I tried to back up further. My back smashed the metal legs of the table as I came up short. I felt my legs tremble as I shook, and I closed my eyes as I expected to die very messily. I opened them again when I heard the laughter from the doorway as Ralph and Dale came through the door with their cameras in hand. "Oh man, we got you so good!" Ralph laughed. "He bought it hook, line, and sinker," said Dale. "Another classic prank." I couldn't believe it. This had all been some stupid prank for their channel. I watched as the killer doubled over and started laughing too, his crowbar dropping with a plastic thunk to the ground. When the hood came down, I saw it was Titus, our sometimes roadie, when we took our shows on the road. Jeremy leaned in the doorway, laughing uproariously, as the others high-fived and congratulated themselves on scaring me half to death. I wanted to be mad, but I found myself laughing out of pure nervous relief. You jerks, I breathed, accepting Titus's offered hand. You really scared the crap out of me. I slapped Titus on the shoulder. How the hell did you get across 3 theaters in a matter of seconds anyway? Titus looked confused at that. I didn't. I snuck into Ralph's theater through the fire door and waited for you to notice me. Then I ran out after you turned away, coming into Dale's theater and catching him as he tried to escape. I pretended to drag myself behind the seats, Jeremy said. And Kyle? Titus was still laughing, but he looked a little confused. What about him? We didn't even tell him about this prank. You know Kyle's a blabbermouth. He'd have never been able to pull this off. That made me pause for a minute. Where is Kyle? I asked, not seeing him and really being concerned about that for the first time. Ralph and Dale looked at each other. Dunno. No way he's still in that theater. I looked down from the box, and sure enough, Kyle was still in the theater, unmoving and not playing the game. We tried to raise him through the mic again, to no avail, and after thumping on the glass window for a few minutes to get his attention, we decided to go see what was going on with him. The 5 of us came down the stairs and crept toward Kyle's theater. The door creaked ominously as Jeremy pushed it open, and I could see Kyle's head framed by the white screen as he sat upright, staring forward, and I moved inside to go see what was up with him. I came up behind him, pausing as I caught sight of something I hadn't seen before from my high vantage point. I didn't need to touch him to realize why he wasn't going to answer me, and they all drew close as I took a few balky steps back. There was a machete sticking through the back of the chair, pinning him to the seat. When the others saw him, they all started freaking out, talking all at once as we tried to figure out what to do next. Ralph wanted to call the police. Jeremy wanted to get the hell out of the theater and then call the police. Dale just wanted to be out of the theater. We all kept trying to talk over each other, our terror rising as we kept stepping on each other's conversation. That's why it took so long to realize that Titus was gone. We looked around for him, but no one could remember if he'd come into the theater with us. The last time anyone had seen him was in the projection booth. That seemed to be the deciding factor for Dale. He had his phone out, dialing 911 before anyone could say anything about it. Jeremy slapped it out of his hand, though, and the two of them stared at each other in surprise. Jeremy seemed as surprised by what he had done as Dale was to have his phone slapped away. It bounced under a nearby seat, and the two of them just stood silently for a few seconds before Dale asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. I don't want to be involved with this. If you call the cops, I'm going to lose my job. Screw your job, Dale yelled. At least one person is dead. Let's just leave first. We can get outside and then call them. You two can stay and say that this was your idea, and I can... Dale was dropping to his hands and knees, looking for his phone under the seat. Man, that's some cowardly shit. One of our friends is dead, and you're worried about losing your job. Man, I can't believe I ever... His words were cut off, though, when someone drug him under the seat, and he started screaming. We scattered as Dale screamed, all 3 of us flying like quail, as we tried to put as much distance between ourselves and the killer as possible. I had my phone out as I left the theater, dialing the number for emergency services as I went. I vaulted the concession counter and hid behind it as the line buzzed and buzzed. I sat there shaking, the smell of old popcorn and aged soda in my nose as I waited for someone to pick up. 911, what is your emergency? I sighed, glad to hear someone outside of this place. I told them I was at the Megaplex and that I needed the police there immediately. I told them how we had used Jeremy's keys to get inside, how we were planning to set up a stream and play games in the creepy theater, how they had pulled a prank on me that had started all of this. I told her about Kyle and Titus and about all my friends who were probably being murdered right now that we had split up. And I told her once again that I needed help. I felt the tears roll down my face as I started to cry. She assured me that help was on the way, but that I needed to stay on the line. That was when someone kicked the counter from the other side, and I practically threw my phone in surprise. I could hear the lady on the other end calling my name, seeing if I was there, but my phone had landed against the opposite counter, and my attention was dominated by a hulking figure standing over me. The bar came up to his waist. The guy was nearly 7.5 feet tall, and dressed in cast-off clothes and a long coat with a hood. He was holding the crowbar, his sightless face looking down at me, and then he smashed the crowbar against the glass, and I felt drops of something splatter across my face. I wiped them off and saw the red streaks on my fingers, realizing that his crowbar was splattered with blood. For a moment, we just stared at each other, his featureless face glowering at me. I couldn't see him glowering, but I could feel it as he glowered at me in disapproval. I had come into his den, his hunting ground, and now I was his prey. He turned, taking a step towards the opening that would let him behind the counter, and I weighed my escape options. I could try to vault the counter, but it seemed likely that he would catch me before I got to the door. If I sat right there, I'd get killed in short order, but if I sprinted for the area behind the concession stand, where the door was we'd come through, he might not be able to catch me in time. This seemed like my best course of action. He would likely still get me before I got to the door, but it was my only hope of escaping. The choice, however, was made for me. He had just stepped into the space between the counter and the back when the blue lights framed him up, and he looked at the big glass door in front of the building. He broke and ran for the back of the megaplex then, back towards the theaters, back towards whatever nest he had made for himself back there. The cops found me behind the counter a few minutes later. A search of the megaplex turned up the rest of my friends, or what was left of them at least. Each of them had been killed. They had been stabbed or bludgeoned or just strangled with the bare hands of that imposing shade. I was the only survivor, it seemed, and the police were very interested in getting my statement. That's why I'm here in this interrogation room, filling out this report. They haven't talked about criminal charges yet. I think they figure I've suffered enough. What they want is my complete report on the happenings of this evening. You can be certain that I'll never forget the events of tonight's stream. The last stream of my career, very likely. "Rachel, are you sitting right in front of that television again?" came her mother's high, reedy voice from the kitchen. "No," Rachel called back, her voice incredulous, as if her mom would just assume something like that. Like she'd just hear the TV, always television to her, and always in the tone of deepest scorn, and assume that Rachel was sitting 5 feet from it. In truth, it would have likely been easier to split the atom than slide a piece of notebook paper between Rachel's face and the murky glow of the old television set. Like most of the children who had reached the age of 10 in this time of technological marvels, Rachel found her entire world balanced within the glow of that box. In it were held the 500 TV channels of her life. Sports, cartoons, news, cartoons, current events, cartoons, and the scary movies that her mother would have had a fit if she knew she were watching. Rachel quickly spooled the channels through to the 5 or 6 that showed scary movies, being careful to move the volume down to 2 little green bumps that would ensure her mother didn't hear the TV. Her mother would have an absolute coronary if she knew Rachel was watching anything that wasn't approved family television by the Council for Moral and Ethical Values. Even in her head, Rachel always assumed this name was delivered in a reedy, nasal voice of a cultured and obviously boring old man. The whole town was like that, so caught up in their own ancient sense of what was right and wrong that they didn't seem to understand that times were changing. It was like Burrow was caught in the 50s sometimes. All the kids in town lived on their TVs. It was just a way of life. She spooled through the TV guide and saw that 3 movies were playing later that she wanted to see. Carrie was playing at 10:30, but that was much too soon. Her mother might be good and asleep by 11, but not by 10:30. The other channel, however, was showing Child's Play at 10:30, followed by something called Darkhaven. As she read the description, she knew that Darkhaven was the one she wanted to see tonight. The description sounded pretty cool, and it promised a true scare not often found in modern horror. The runtime was just over an hour, too, so even if her mom woke up at 2, as she was sometimes wont to do, she could easily be back in bed and well asleep before. "And what is this?" Rachel squeaked a little, and the remote clattered to the floor. Batteries rolled hither and thither as the back cover came off, and she turned her head to see her mother hovering over her. Rachel's mother wasn't an unattractive woman, but the worry lines and stress a pair of jobs brought on her had worn her down before her time. She now stood, legs spread in a linebacker's blocking stance, with her thick blonde hair thrown hastily into a messy tail, and her hands covered in the remains of tonight's dinner dish suds. Her face wasn't set cruelly, despite what Rachel thought. She'd never once seen anything more than parental displeasure from her mother. She was wearing the stern look she reserved just for Rachel, though, it seemed. "Nothing," Rachel said again. Just trying to give herself nightmares for the next 500 years, she said as she bent down and pushed the button on the front of the TV. It went off with a little staticky smack sound that reduced it to nothing but a dumb, lifeless box. Off to bed now. It's well past your bedtime. The idea that I'd allow such filth in my... But Rachel had listened to just about as much as she cared to of that. She'd frozen on the bottom step like a ballet dancer, preparing for her opening move. And what an opening move this was likely to be. They aren't filth, Mother. I happen to like horror movies. If you weren't so close-minded, maybe you'd find out that you like them too. Her mother's stern face had flushed red at that, the deep scarlet it always turned before the two had one of their more and more common arguments. Don't you dare take that short tone with me, young lady. This is still my house, and as long as you live in my house, you will follow my rules, and you can forget about TV for 2 days because of your sass. Rachel was affronted, but that's not fair. What am I supposed to do for 2 days? There's nothing else to do in this stupid town. No one ever wants to play outside or come over to visit. They all just want to watch TV. Well, for 2 days, I guess you won't be one of them. Maybe you can be the first one to actually go out, and why don't you just admit it? Why don't you just admit that you hate me? Why don't you just admit that you love making my life miserable? A silence hung between them for a minute. Rachel was walking down a dark path, but she didn't care. She knew that what she would do next would hurt her mother, hurt her worse than she'd ever hurt her before, but she didn't care. And just where did you get an idea like that? Why would I hate you? Her mother's voice was incredulous and low, as though it was all she could do to breathe out the words. I heard you once, talking to Mrs. Dempsey, talking about all the things you'd do if only you didn't have children. All the exciting things the two of you would do if only you didn't have children at home to take care of. Well, why don't you just go and do them? Because I honestly wish that I didn't have a mother. She didn't even stop to see how deeply she had wounded her. She stormed upstairs and slammed her door shut between herself and the whole stupid world. She came awake all at once and looked over at the clock on her bedside table. 11:30 p.m. She couldn't believe she'd dozed off. What if she'd missed it? She'd already had to miss child's play thanks to her mother's stupid racket. She rolled away from the clock and couldn't help feeling sorry for her mother. She'd expected another fight, a longer punishment maybe. She might have even sassed her way into what her friends called a spanking, which her mother had never believed in. Instead, she'd just cried. Rachel had heard her climb the stairs from underneath her covers and was sure that the door would open any minute. Her mother would come storming in with a belt or a paddle or maybe even just her hand and a still glowering rage at her cheeky daughter. But instead, she just went to bed. She'd opened her door and flopped out onto the big bed she'd once shared with Rachel's father before he left, and began to cry. Rachel couldn't remember ever hearing her mother cry, not even when she was 3. Her father had left, saying it just wasn't working out. He didn't love Rachel's mother anymore, and hadn't even bothered to say anything to Rachel. For the better part of an hour, her mother had sobbed furiously, choked anguished sobs that she didn't think would ever end, at least until she'd heard them change into deep, rhythmic snores. This had been at about 10:05, but Rachel hadn't dared to sneak down to the TV. Her mother could be shamming, though Rachel didn't think she was. Rachel didn't want to risk missing the movie she really wanted to see because she had been too hasty. She'd seen Child's Play about 100 times anyway, and had decided to close her eyes just for a second when 11:35 p.m. She'd sneak down to the living room in about 20 minutes, just to make sure that her mother was still good and asleep. No sense spoiling it now by being overeager. She rolled over, and her guilt rolled with her. She shouldn't have said that to her mom. It wasn't fair, and thinking about it now, her mother probably meant nothing by it. Whose mother didn't want a life where they didn't have responsibilities or children? Rachel was mature enough to understand that, but 11:38 p.m. But it was still a rotten thing to say. Rachel was here, and her mother thinking that way made her feel like she didn't care whether she lived or died. And she was always such a bother anyway. Rachel, clean your room. Rachel, finish your vegetables. That's not appropriate subject matter for a child your age, Rachel. What did she know anyway? Who was she to judge what was and wasn't right for her to do? 11:39 p.m. Rachel rolled over angrily, and now time was being slow on purpose. She listened closely again and could still hear her mother's deep snoring from the other room. She could probably sneak down right now and catch the climactic ending of Child's Play. Her mother would never be the wiser. But no, Rachel wouldn't spoil it for a bad slasher flick ending that she'd seen 100 times. She'd bide her time until 11:41 p.m. She was sure that she could sneak down and not get caught. She felt her eyes getting heavy again and stifled a yawn. She would not get tired and fall asleep. That was not an option. She lasted this long, and she would last a little longer. She'd have to make sure she didn't fall asleep on the couch or something, like that one time a few months ago. Luckily, her mom hadn't woken up till nearly 7 after the storm had knocked the power out. The TV had been off, and all she'd been able to yell at her for was not waking her up and falling asleep on the couch. Oh, but hadn't that been a good night? Watching Ether Man during a rainstorm, and having to stifle a scream when the lightning had peeled out just as the knife slash had landed. 11:43 p.m. Rachel threw the covers off angrily. If time wasn't going to cooperate, then she'd just go ahead and risk it. She pulled on her fluffy pink slippers and her black bathrobe for night sneaking, and opened the door to her room carefully. It gave 1 or 2 traitorous squeaks, but they were small ones. Her mother's breathing never altered in the least. She slunk carefully into the hallway, past her mother's door, and down the steps as she tried hard to avoid the loose 8th step. Finally, she was down in the living room. She flipped on the TV and was bathed instantly in its warm, staticky glow. It was on the right channel, too. Child's Play was just ending, the credits beginning to roll, and the volume was still at the right level for night watching. She reclined against the couch as she waited for the letters to glide slowly to an end. She folded over herself and took a pillow off the couch to rest her head against. As the last name spilled sluggishly by, the screen lit up with a short infomercial about stock in a growing business firm. She flipped on the info button and read the description of Darkhaven again. As the smiling cowboy-hatted speaker finally delivered his tagline, "So put your trust in smiling Walter Rigsby, and you'll see the returns growing like our condos." Then the screen went eerily dark for what felt like hours. When it lit again, it was panning in on a dark forest, probably one in New England or Maine, and Rachel was accosted by the creepy circus grind of the intro music. She sighed. She couldn't believe she'd be missing TV for 2 days because of a slop-budget late 70s B-movie. The production value looked shoddy, even to a 10-year-old, and the camera work looked like some guy with a camcorder had shot it. She shrugged. Might as well see how it played out. It was only an hour and change anyway. The story started slow. Some settlers on a boat were in a bad storm, one of those Christopher Columbus specials with masts and lots of wood. A man on board was writing to his wife about how he missed her and wished she'd come with him to the new colony. There was some flashbacks, him arguing with some other buckle hat guy and asking some others to leave with him. Then a guy burst into his cabin and told him he was needed on deck. The following scene had been a little cool. Some of the men that came up to help had been washed overboard as they tried to save the ship. The actors were doing a pretty good job of drowning as the boat sailed away, unable to rescue them, though they were certainly trying with all they had. It got boring again pretty quick after they landed. Lots of farming, lots of good morrows and banter. There was one old woman they seemed to think was a witch, but they left her alone instead of burning her like they usually did in these types of movies. Rachel was starting to nod off when an Indian came into town one day, accompanied by some equally as unbelievably white-looking Indians. He told the letter writer, who was their mayor or leader or something, that they had settled on sacred ground to the local tribe, and that they would have to move the town or suffer the Indians' wrath. This led to a good little stretch of Indians returning nightly to burn their houses and kill people. Believably kill people, too. When one Indian brave buried his tomahawk in one of the settlers, she wasn't honestly sure she could see the effects that made the blood splatter. The scalping looked pretty grisly, too, as did the horse dragging and the execution of the braves they caught during the attack. This progressed until the people of the village had gathered to try to find a way to stop the Indians from attacking Darkhaven. The Indians had called it Darkhaven in their native tongue, and so some of the settlers had taken to calling it that too. Rachel was interested by this point. The movie had turned out to be not only very gory, but also very grabbing. She couldn't remember why it had been boring before. Suddenly, every character seemed more than real, and every death was as real as it would have been if it had been one of her own family members. The village's salvation came from an unexpected source. The old witch woman turned out to have a book that told her how to call forth a terrible power. "He will crush the savages," she told them, "in exchange for a pure soul." The townspeople then, with little to no discussion it seemed, rushed out to find a virgin, despite the protests of their leader and the local priest. Rachel sat close, a paper's breadth between her and the TV. They took a young woman and strapped her to the ground. The old witch cackled as she drew around the sobbing girl in the dirt, and the woman screamed and writhed as she pulled at her chains. She begged them to release her, tears pouring down her face as the old hag began to work her magic. The townspeople, for their part, mostly just stood around and looked somber and embarrassed. They didn't seem to know what to do here, and as the witch's spell began, many seemed to have second thoughts. It was too late, though. The drawing in the dirt began to glow painfully bright, and thrum in a dark crystalline purple that made Rachel squint. The woman screamed and screamed as the black ooze spilled from the ground. The ooze rolled over her dress, up her legs, and slid into her mouth with... The scene suddenly turned to snow. Signal lost. "No!" Rachel howled, throwing a hand over her mouth a second later to stifle the furious scream that would have followed. She began to pound her fist on the glass eye that so cruelly cheated her. She began to scream as loud as she dared at this hateful little monster of glass and plastic. She hated it. It built her up, and then snatched her prize away at the last minute. She hated it so much she... Her hand made a wet sound as she struck the screen. She pulled her fist back and looked down at the darkened surface. What was that? She held it to the salt and pepper snow of the television and looked in confusion at the dark liquid on her fist. Was that mud? Is her hand covered in... Good God! As she looked down at the slick substance on the underside of her curled fist, it writhed and pulled away from her skin slightly. No, it was a trick of the light. It had to be. It had to be blood or something. She'd burst a vessel, slamming her stupid hand against the TV. That had to be it. It couldn't... Plop. She looked up. Plop. Something was falling out of the TV. Plop. Plop. Was it her blood? There seemed to be an awful lot of it. It pooled on the carpet before her eyes, coming out in rivulets from the staticky eye. It soaked into the thick tangle of shaggy carpet, and Rachel scuttled crab-like away from it. One huge piece fell from the center of the snow. It's quivering. It's beating, Rachel thought. She didn't know why she thought this until something solid floated to the top of the pool. It rolled drunkenly in the murk, and as it rolled, it began to pulsate, to throb, to send little ripples out from the pulsating mass. It was a heart. The goop began to move, congealing, and then lifting itself up bonelessly like a waterspout from the world's darkest puddle. It hung there looking at her as it studied her scared face. Though it had no eyes, she knew it looked. She felt her breath coming in stuttering skips as she stared into the scariest thing she had ever seen in her whole life. It wavered like the jello her mother sometimes made for dessert. Then one thin leg broke from the black surge and took a liquid step towards her. She was over the couch in a flash and watched as it buckled and fell juicily against the coffee table, full of old art books her mother had lovingly kept there. It splattered and covered the chintzy farmscape, but then drew itself back together quickly as it began to assume a more human form. Its arms and legs were too thin, its torso like one of those department store mannequins she'd seen in Woolworth's, and its head was a vague oval with a sleek, featureless face. But still, she knew. It saw her. Her fear grabbed her fully, but unlike most children, her fear always transferred into flight. She took to the stairs 3 at a time. She drove through her bedroom door and slammed it shut behind her. It rattled and buckled not a heartbeat later, and came open with a monstrous crunch. She was thrown like a rag doll across the room and onto her own bed. The creature was inside, already lunging towards her. It tripped on those 2 thin legs, though, and one of them connected with her beanbag chair. She leapt over it. She was out of her room again, slamming the door shut behind her as the creature gained its feet again. She ran to her mother's room, her fists sounding like cannon shots as she banged frantically on the door. "Mom! Mommy! Please! Help me!" Her mother, dressed in the same rumpled clothes she'd come home in, threw the door open, brandishing a long wooden bat as she came into the hallway. She looked left, looked right, and then dropped panting to clutch at Rachel. "Honey? Rachel, what's wrong?" "A man, a thing, it's in my room, it's... But then she realized with real terror that it hadn't followed her. Something that quick should have been through the door and after her in a heartbeat. She looked back at the closed door, and dread began to coil there. Why hadn't it come after her? Rachel's mother looked at the door, and then pushed her daughter behind her. "I'll go have a look. You stay here. Call 911 if something happens." "No, Mom, please. Please don't leave me. Let's go call them now, and they can..." But she was down the hall, and to the door faster than the creature could have even managed. Her mother put herself against the wall like a SWAT cop preparing to burst into a drug house. She brought her foot up and kicked the door, and Rachel cringed and closed her eyes, expecting the thing to leap on her mother in 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. No screaming, no yelling, nothing. She opened her eyes and saw her mother walking around the room, checking in the closet, looking under the bed, behind the furniture. She had turned on the lights, and with it didn't seem half so scary as it had a minute ago. Her mother swept the entire room 3 times, baseball bat at the ready, but after the 3rd time, she shrugged and turned back to her still shivering daughter. "Well, no boogeymen, Rachel. No monsters, no shadows, but I did find this little creature waiting patiently for you to stumble over him." She held out a well-worn teddy that Rachel had had since she was a baby. She'd put it on top of her closet. It seemed childish to have something like that on her bed at her age, but she was honestly glad to see it now. Her mother smiled and took a step towards the door. "Look who doesn't need a mother now, huh?" she said, not in her snippy ha-ha voice, but in her warm mother voice Rachel had heard less and less of these days, and would never hear again. Before she made it halfway to the threshold, the light on her table popped off with a smell like burning plastic. Rachel's mother turned to look at it, her face now cut in half by the darkness, but only Rachel saw the thin sliver of darkness that wrapped lovingly around her ankle. Her mother registered it a moment before it went taut as a noose, and Rachel saw a sad mix of terror, regret, and savage resolve to fight anything that threatened her child. Surprise and bemusement at the thought of being so vulnerable in her own home snap across her mother's face. "Rachel," she said, before she was dragged bonelessly to the floor and pulled, hardwood ribbons rising from her fingernails, under the bed. The baseball bat made a queer hollow plink as it hit the floor, a heartbeat before that ragged old bear. By then, though, her mother had disappeared an eternity ago to her daughter's eyes, into the inky blackness beneath her bed. The door slammed, and Rachel was left alone in the hallway. I've been searching for this tape most of my life. I've thought about nothing else since it was taken from me 12 years ago. As I sit in my grandmother's bedroom, holding the familiar red plastic in my hands, I feel a sense of inner peace. I know that my search is over, and that serenity can follow. Mr. Harzows Corner was a show that I watched religiously from the age of 4 to 6. It wasn't some mysterious TV show that I saw on basic cable. It wasn't some scrambled signal I got from a weird public access network. It was actually something I found at a church rummage sale. The box of VHS tapes was sitting on a little table with the words 5 for $1 scrolled across it in permanent marker. I had leafed through it and seen the usual church swap meet stuff. Winnie the Pooh, VeggieTales, all the Disney movies with their cracked plastic windows and dirty fingerprints on the names. But nothing really stood out. I had selected a few Winnie the Pooh episodes when I found the dirty plastic cassette near the bottom. It had a lurid red body, the color similar to old lipstick, and a handwritten name on the front. The black magic marker name read Mr. Harzows Corner, and it immediately caught my attention for some reason. I picked it up and just looked at it for a moment. I had grown up in an age of strange cassette tapes. Nickelodeon put out the chunky orange cassette tapes that often had episodes of Rugrats or Wild Thornberrys. And even some of the VeggieTales cassettes were different colors, depending on whether they were holiday specials or not. This one, however, seemed odd right off the bat. The plastic just felt thick in my fingers, and I remember both wanting to put it down and never put it down again. Finally, after 10 minutes of just looking at it, I did put it down, and I grabbed 2 cassettes featuring episodes of Barbie's Dream House, a Nickelodeon cassette featuring the Rugrats, and 2 with handwritten names saying they were old Winnie the Pooh cartoon episodes. I brought them to my mom, and after looking over them, she nodded and gave me $1. I had taken them to Miss Wazowski, the cheery old lady who often organizes these rummage sales, and she put them in a plastic grocery bag and smiled at me as I walked to rejoin my mom. It wasn't until I got home that I realized there was a 6th tape in that bag, though. I had just turned on the VCR TV combo in my room when I realized there was an unfamiliar, yet very familiar red cassette tape at the bottom of the bag that had definitely not been there when I'd checked out. I picked it up and saw that Mr. Harzows Corner was scrawled across the front, and it was weird that I didn't remember picking it up at all. Instead of putting it back, I put it in the VCR and watched as the static began to clear on the screen. I had been intending to watch some of the Winnie the Pooh episodes, but the bag of tapes would sit forgotten for quite some time. Mr. Harzows Corner would be the only thing I really cared about for the foreseeable future. The show appeared to be nothing special. It was clearly a Mr. Rogers knockoff, but the Mr. Harzow character was strange, yet endearing. He looked normal enough, a slight blonde guy, taller than your average kids show host, with a corduroy jacket and a pair of battered jeans that covered the tops of his Reebok sneakers. The camera showed him coming into a normal living room, again very reminiscent of Mr. Rogers, and then greeting everyone with a big smile and a waving hand. "Good afternoon, boys and girls. And of course, a very special afternoon to children of all ages. Welcome to Mr. Harzows Corner. Know that I am glad to see you, and that I am always here, just for you." As it went on, Mr. Harzows Corner turned out to be nothing like Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Mr. Rogers often taught children life lessons about accepting people and being a friend, and lessons about how the world worked. Mr. Harzows Corner was more like having your own personal therapist inside your TV. Mr. Harzow taught no life lessons. He went on no adventures in make-believe. He just sat in his big easy chair with a cup of tea at his elbow and listened. First time I watched the episode, I was a little bit confused. After his greeting, he just leaned back and looked at me, smiling in a very strange way. His smile was warm, inviting even, but he seemed to be waiting for someone on the other end of the camera to begin talking. He just sat there staring at me, and I began to become a little creeped out. Even at 4, I knew it was a little bit unusual for adults to just sit there and stare at you. I remember reaching out to hit stop on the tape when suddenly Mr. Harzow cocked his head and seemed to speak directly to me. "Leaving so soon? I understand. Well, I'm glad you came to see me today. I hope you'll come again very soon." My finger stopped over the button. Was he talking to me? It seemed like he had been, but this was just a VHS tape. This was an age before interactive tapes, and the idea that the VHS could talk to you was a little eerie, but also a little bit interesting. When he had spoken directly to me, I had remembered feeling a little sad that I was leaving already. He seemed like he understood, but maybe he was a little sad to see me go as well. I recalled my hand, and that big grin spread across his face again. "Changed your mind? I'm so glad. So why don't you tell me about your day? I'm sure I'd love to hear all about it." I sat for a moment, thinking about what to do. Finally, I told the smiling stranger on the tape about my day. I told him about my mother, and going to the rummage sale, about finding his cassette tape, about bringing all the cassette tapes home, and discovering that his cassette tape was in with the ones I'd bought. I told him I hoped I wouldn't get in trouble for having 6 instead of 5 cassette tapes, because my mother would think I had stolen it and she would get mad. Through it all, Mr. Harzow just sat and nodded, smiling his smile and listening as if I had the most interesting things in the world to talk about. Even at 4, though, I began to think that this was just someone pretending to listen. I remember thinking back to shows like Dora the Explorer, where Dora would ask a question and then pretend to listen to your answer. No matter what you told her to do, whether it was to go towards the next thing she had to do or sit in the grass and look at the clouds, she always came up with the right answer and went off to do what she was supposed to. I assumed that Mr. Harzow would do the same. He would interrupt me any minute now, just like Dora did if you spoke for too long, and start on some pre-scripted bit of dialogue. But he didn't. He sat and listened politely until I was done speaking. Then he nodded and answered me as if we were two people having a normal conversation. "It sounds as though it's been an exciting day for you. I'm glad you got to go and do something important, something that you enjoy. It's a real honor to be part of your life, and I hope we can be friends for many years to come." I spent the rest of the day in my room, talking with Mr. Harzow and telling him about my family, my home, and my life. He always seemed interested in my stories, and he always listened with that big smile and that fatherly way of talking about everything. My mom called me for dinner, and he said he would wait for me to come back. When I returned, he was still sitting and looking at the screen like I had never left. He asked me about dinner, and we talked until it was time for me to go to bed. "Will I see you tomorrow?" he asked, and I assured him that he would. I nearly left the TV on and just went to bed, but something told me that might be a bad idea. Not because the tape was cursed or haunted, but because Mom might come in and find it on. She might talk to Mr. Harzow, and Mr. Harzow might decide to be her friend instead of mine. The thought of losing Mr. Harzow, even after such a short time, made me feel furious, and I turned off the tape and went grudgingly to bed. I spent the next 5 months with my nose pressed against the TV screen, and Mr. Harzow listening to all my problems and woes. When my mom grounded me after the dog knocked the lamp over, he listened and consoled me. When my dad accidentally bumped me and I fell down the last 3 stairs, he was the one who told me it would all be okay. Every childhood problem, every unforeseen event, Mr. Harzow was there for me. It wasn't just that he listened. It wasn't even his advice that made me love him so. When Mr. Harzow talked to you, you felt like you were the most important person in the world. His attention was the most important thing you could ever have, and my 4-year-old brain drank that attention in. I became hesitant to leave the house, making up excuses why Mom couldn't go places, since I'd have to come with her. I wanted to spend every waking moment with my new friend, but something on the horizon would leave me with even less time with my dear Mr. Harzow. When I had to start kindergarten, Mr. Harzow told me how it would be new and exciting, and how he wanted to hear all about it when I got home. I attended kindergarten for about a week, coming straight home to lay on the floor of my room and talk with my new friend. When Mom got a new job. She had landed a job as a tech support supervisor for a new company, which meant she couldn't take me after school anymore. Dad worked in a prison, so he was almost always at work. It began to look like I might have to go into after-school care. I was understandably upset about this, because it would limit the already slim time I had to chat with Mr. Harzow. Fortunately, there was an alternative. My grandmother agreed to take me after school. My grandmother lived alone, my grandfather having died before I was born, and I think she was excited about watching me. Grandma had been very sad since my grandfather's passing, and it had turned her into a quiet shell of her former self. My mom always talked about what an outspoken and vivacious woman my grandmother had been when she was younger, and now it seemed like I might get to meet this new grandma. As bad as it sounds, I wasn't really all that interested in any of it, though. I simply wanted a place with a VHS player so I could watch my tape. At first, that was all we did, too. Grandma would pick me up from school, asking how my day had been, and asking what I might like to do once we got home, and I would tell her that I wanted to watch my tapes in the den. She would offer to bake cookies with me, or maybe take me to the park, but I was fully invested in the silky voice of Mr. Harzow. I would come in and lay my book bag down and go sit in the den for hours as I talked quietly to my good friend about everything and anything. He smiled when I told him about my grandma, and said it was nice that I was keeping her company. Grandmothers are such a valuable resource of knowledge, and the fact that you have such a good relationship with yours is truly special. I agreed, but I was still very guarded about the tape. I would often turn it off when Grandma brought me snacks, or asked if I was interested in going outside. I didn't want her to see Mr. Harzow, and I think I was still afraid that she would take him away from me if she saw him. She would want him to be her friend, and then I would be unable to see him, since he would want to spend all his time with her. Mr. Harzow never said as much. All of his advice was placidly given through the TV after he had sat and listened to me. But I knew that if I coveted this tape, then others might as well. Over time, Grandma did manage to coax me out of the den. I was 5 after all, and the smell of cookies or the promise of ice cream had a talismanic effect on me still. Mr. Harzow became an after-dinner friend, a rainy day friend, but I still found myself wanting to spend as much time with him as I could. No matter what I was doing, playing on the swings or sitting in class or making cookies with Grandma, or even sleeping in my bed, it seemed that I was thinking about Mr. Harzow. I would find myself hungry for any time I could get with him, and there were nights that I quietly whispered to him from the floor of my room as my parents slept not too far away. It didn't come to a head until I got careless at Grandma's house one day. It had been the best day my 6-year-old brain could remember. Grandma had taken me to the local carnival, more of a street fair than a regular fair, and I had done it all. I had ridden ponies, I had eaten so much I thought I would bust, I had seen clowns and jugglers and listened to bands, and for a moment I'd even stopped feeling the tug of Mr. Harzow. We came home and I ate dinner, and Grandma asked me if I wanted some TV time before my mom came to pick me up. I said I did, and I rushed off to tell Mr. Harzow about all the exciting things I had done and seen, and he laughed and told me how much fun it all sounded like. As he spoke, I remember yawning as his pleasant voice drifted over me, and when I felt my face drifting towards the carpet, I don't even think I was aware I was going to sleep. When I woke up in my bed the next morning, I was confused. When I couldn't find my videotape in my bag before school, I was frantic. I thought about it the whole way to school and decided that I must have left it at Grandma's house. I had fallen asleep in front of the little TV in the guest room, and so the tape must still be there. I figured it wouldn't be a problem. Grandma was going to come pick me up after school, so I could get it while I was there. When my mom picked me up instead, I was a little bit confused. "Sorry, sweetie, but Grandma's sick, so she can't take you today." Mom had taken off work for the afternoon to pick me up, and I spent the afternoon walking around the house like a junkie. I hadn't been without my tape for the last few years, so being without it now was like torture. I tried to go out and play, but I just couldn't get interested in any of the games. I tried to watch TV, but none of my favorite shows seemed to hold my attention. I just walked around aimlessly, wanting to talk to Mr. Harzow. I'd had a pretty good day that day. He would want to hear about it. He would want to hear about how my team had won at dodgeball, about how my sculpture had been praised by the teacher in art class, about how I'd made a new friend. Not being able to tell him was torture, but I knew I had to stay strong. Grandma would be better tomorrow. I just knew it. It turned out Grandma was sick that whole week, though. By the end of that week, I was becoming a mess. My parents just saw it as me being a hyperactive kid, but I felt like I was actually going through withdrawals. Sometimes I would just lie on the floor, knees tucked to my chest, and hyperventilate. I remember vividly the feeling of my breath as it rushed out and rasped wetly against my skin. I remember feeling like I might vomit, but being unable to bring up anything. I remember my dad finally taking me and putting me in my room one Saturday, because I had done nothing for 3 hours but stare at the ceiling and shudder. This will sound dramatic to you as you sit in your nice warm house. You'll think I was just overreacting or being a spoiled child who couldn't get their way. Some of you, though, the ones who have loved something self-destructive and lived through it, might understand what it was like. After a week, I asked my mom if maybe we could go visit Grandma. I told my mom I was worried about her and wanted to see her. We were driving back from school, Grandma having been sick all week, and the idea suddenly occurred to me that maybe we could go check on her. Anything at this point to get my fix. Mom had knocked about 20 times when she finally used the spare key to open the lock and head inside. I was in as soon as the gap in the door was big enough. The house looked different, but I hardly noticed. I was charging down the hall to the guest room, Mom calling for my grandmother as she came inside behind me. The door to the little guest room was ajar, and I crashed through it and knelt before the silent altar of that cold little TV on the floor. I pushed the button, but nothing happened. I pushed it again, but still nothing happened. I peeked into the VCR slot and found it empty. Someone had taken my tape. I came hobbling from the room on all fours, probably possessed of that "give us the precious" look old Smeagol showed to Frodo far too often. I heard Mom in the kitchen, still looking for my grandma, but I only had one thing on my mind. Mr. Harzow had to be here somewhere. At the bottom of the stairs, I stopped, cocking my head like a dog as I listened. I could hear him. I could hear Mr. Harzow. I could hear the melodic sound of his voice. I could hear the soothing tones that had so often told me that everything would be fine. I had craved that voice for the past 7 days, and now it was so close I could almost taste it. I ambled up the stairs as quiet as I could, pressing my ear to the door of my grandma's room. I could hear him telling her how he understood her woes and commiserated with her sorrow. I shoved the door open, looking into the squalor that had become my grandmother's room. It was filthy, A smell like waste just left to drop where it would assaulted my nose, along with the smell of spoiled food. Grandma was perched on the bed like a gargoyle, her eyes glued to the little TV on the nightstand. The glow from it illuminated her face like a death mask. It had only been a week, but she looked so haggard and so old that it almost scared me to look at her. She jumped when I screamed at her to give me back my tape. She covered the TV, the screen making her eyes shine with lust as the two of us yelled at each other like angry cats. I told her how unfair it was that she could just take things from me and demanded that she give it back. She said it was her tape now and that she would never give it back. In the background, I could also hear the consoling voice of Mr. Harzow as he told us to both find a compromise and that fighting was never the answer. I could hear Mom downstairs, her feet pounding up the hardwood, the sound of us fighting having galvanized her. Mom walked in just as Grandma dealt me a vicious slap across the cheek, rocking my head to the side and sending me sprawling to the floor. I can remember the two of them shouting at each other as easily as I can remember my favorite television show. They never came to blows, but it was very close a few times. Mom wanted to know just what the hell was going on. Grandma kept shrieking that she wanted us out, all the while clutching her murky television set. She said we were not welcome here anymore. She said she never wanted to see us again. She said that she would call the police if we didn't leave immediately. All the while, I could hear Mr. Harzow whispering for her not to do such a thing, for her to work out her problems, to reconcile with her loved ones. Far from making her see reason, hearing her voice only seemed to harden her resolve. Hearing his voice only made me want to bask in the glow of that murky television set all the more. Finally, we left, my mother weeping openly as she dragged me kicking and screaming down the stairs. That was the last time I heard his voice. For 12 years. You would say that after 12 years I might have forgotten about Mr. Harzow. You might think that after 12 years I would have surely moved on with my life. You might assume that I would find other hobbies and interests besides talking to a man that lives inside a VHS tape. You would be wrong. Dead wrong. When it became apparent that I couldn't get the tape back, I started searching. This was the early days of the internet, and I started furiously pursuing information online about similar tapes or similar programs. I didn't find much. There were a handful of people who were clearly just playing around, a few others who were trying to use the tape, and my obvious desire for it, to lure me into something terrible. Neither of these bothered me much, but the others showed me something I didn't want to see. Becky and Steven were two users I spoke to on a forum who believed they had actually come into contact with Mr. Harzow. Both had the kind of conversations with me that smack addicts likely had with each other. They spoke of their time with him lovingly, their words painting a picture of almost worshipful need. Becky said she had spent 10 years with Mr. Harzow before her mother had taken her television and thrown it out. She locked Becky in her room, and Becky had been forced to watch the truck come and take the TV, VHS and all away forever. Steven had a similar story, but his tape had been destroyed in a fire when his house had burned to the ground. That was 2 years ago when I found them, and I had no idea how much they would affect my search. About a year after meeting Steven, he stopped talking altogether. Becky and I assumed that something must have happened to him. He had been teetering lately, rolling in the memories of his time with Mr. Harzow, like a dog rolling in a smell it likes, and he had been talking about self-harm a lot. When he didn't sign on for about a week, Becky and I assumed he had finally had enough of dwelling on something that he couldn't have. His last message read, "I'll be with him soon." Becky, on the other hand, saw an opportunity that I never would have foreseen. She had been asking a lot of very loaded questions about where I lived, and more importantly, where my grandmother lived. You see, Grandma was still alive, even after 12 years of living under Mr. Harzow's watchful eye. No one had seen her, no one had heard from her, and she just sort of lived off her retirement and her slowly deteriorating house. I had walked by a few times, trying to find a way inside while she was away, but she never left. Her groceries were delivered, her mail spilled from her box, and she simply existed inside her crumbling tomb. I saw what Becky was after and refused to tell her where she could find my tape. Becky, it seems, was more resourceful than I had thought, though. About a week ago, Mom got a call that Grandma had died. The police told us that someone had broken into her house, probably thinking it was abandoned, and found her in her bedroom. The two had fought, and despite her age, Grandma had strangled them to death. Her heart, however, wasn't quite as strong as her hands, and she had died with her fingers pressed into the flesh of the intruder. The intruder had been identified as Rebecca Smythe, a resident of California, who seemed to have driven 800 miles just to break into my grandmother's house. It seemed that my internet friend had finally pinpointed where my grandmother lived, and it had been the end of her. The night after the funeral, I made my move. I broke a window around back, we no longer had a key to the house, and made my way through the unfamiliar squalor. The house was a wreck, junk and garbage piled everywhere, and when I finally found the stairs, I breathed a sigh of relief. They were sagging, the wood groaning as I walked up them, but they were still intact, and my prize was within reach. The TV was on the nightstand, its soft glow illuminating the bed where Grandma had breathed her last. The tape sat in the murky light, like a red invitation, or a jolly splash of blood. I've been holding it, feeling its red plastic in my fingers for nearly an hour, as I contemplate whether or not to slide it in. It's not a question of whether I will or not. I have missed Mr. Harzow desperately for the last 12 years, but I wanted to take down this story before I give my life back to him. You may think this is his fault somehow, but I cannot blame him for what has happened. He told my grandma on that long ago day to reconcile with us. He never told me to hurt anyone. He never told me to be unkind to anyone. I think that's why people seek him. When Mr. Harzow speaks, you feel as though he speaks only for you. He accepts you, no matter what, and that kind of power is intoxicating. The TV accepted the tape in just the same way it always had, and now he's smiling at me and welcoming me back as an old friend. I think I'll go speak with my old friend for a while. I think I'll go speak with him for the rest of my life. It started as most things do, with boredom. I was surfing around YouTube, looking for funny videos or scary videos, when I stumbled across something that caught my interest. It was run by a user who went by The Meat Man, and it involved stop-motion footage using some very disturbing puppets. The thing that honestly caught my eye first was the thumbnail. It was a figure that appeared to be crafted entirely out of ground meat. I remember seeing the model and lifting an eyebrow as I took in what I was actually seeing. Now, when I tell you that the models were grotesque, I don't mean they were ugly or badly made. They were very well put together, and the amount of detail that had gone into them was astonishing. These meat puppets had hair and clothes and facial features that had all been meticulously crafted to the point of being a little uncanny. I would have almost expected them to blink or move on their own, and they seemed too lifelike for the medium. The episode I had found was episode 5, and as I watched it, I quickly began to realize that this was no normal bit of YouTube content. Episode 5 involved 3 characters, Lisa, Steve, and Michael, as they prepared for the arrival of a 4th character, Dawn. The background music was jangly and discordant, somewhere between a calliope and a merry-go-round, and it often made the voices hard to hear. The characters were cleaning up the house, which was mostly a sheet of paper with windows drawn near the ceiling, and some furniture crafted from modeling clay. As they cleaned, a voice told us how Lisa was being lazy and expected Michael and Steve to do the majority of the work. I remember thinking that was odd because her character moved and dusted and tidied at least as much as the others did, and they seemed to be working well together. After a few minutes of herky-jerky cleaning, a hand came down from the ceiling and congratulated Steve and Michael on a job well done. It then pointed a pudgy finger at Lisa and scolded her for being so lazy. The voice said that Lisa would not be allowed to join the party later, since she hadn't helped. As Michael and Steve walked off stage, Lisa's character curled into a ball as the loud party music played in the background. I remember feeling bad for Lisa as the last frame sat frozen in place, the camera zooming in on the prostrate Lisa, as she sat hunkered against the wall. Though I couldn't hear anything over the loud party music, I could see the small figure shaking a little as though she might be crying. What the hell was this? Why did it suddenly make me feel almost voyeuristic for watching the suffering of a lumpy knot person? After that, my morbid curiosity was hooked. I went to the attached channel and saw that he had about 10 videos up, all added within the last month or so. His channel was small, only about 80 subscribers, and they were all in that same stop-motion style, where he used the figure's grotesqueness to his advantage. I found the first episode, Friendship, and decided to watch it. The video was about Lisa, the meat puppet from before, and how she was sad and lonely all by herself. The puppet mostly sat in the same familiar position, bent over and appearing to sob. Suddenly, 2 other familiar puppets, Steve and Michael, came into the scene, and Lisa seemed happy to see them. The pudgy hand, whom she called Father, said that he had seen that she was lonely and had gotten her some friends so she wouldn't cry so much. The hand stroked her delicate hair, and it seemed to be much nicer to her than it had been in the previous episode. The 3 hugged and said they would be friends forever. Then the episode ended and the screen went black. It had lasted less than 5 minutes all told, but it still made me feel strange and put off. The puppets were so odd-looking, and I just couldn't shake the feeling that there was something not right about them. I was also hooked, and immediately loaded up the second video. It was like a train wreck. I needed to see how it came out, no matter what the carnage looked like. The next 2 episodes were pretty similar to what I'd come to expect. They were called Cohabitation and Family, and followed the lives of Lisa and her new roommates. They set up some furniture and had some getting-to-know-you chatter as wonky music played in the background, making their words hard to hear sometimes. It was the typical stop-motion fare, but there were odd refrains sometimes in the middle of the stop-motion. During one in particular, the boys, Steve and Michael, were talking with Lisa about what they were going to make for dinner. The stop-motion abruptly cut, and you could see 5 or 6 seconds of the model just standing, as loud sobbing came from the background. Amidst that sobbing, there was a soft but angry voice trying to quiet them. I had to rewind it a few times in order to catch it, and I remember wondering if this were some sort of artistic film or something. Was the artist trying to make some kind of point? Maybe he was trying to hide it amidst the stop motion or something, make it even more artsy. It wasn't until the 4th episode that things got bad for Lisa. I noticed that while the first 3 episodes had come out one a day, the 4th video had taken almost a week to come out. This wouldn't have been strange for any other channel, but the total shift from episode 3 to episode 4 was alarming. The video was about 5 minutes long, and seemed to entail Lisa going out on her own for a night walk and getting lost. She had gone out for a walk, despite being told not to by Father Hand, and had gotten herself lost in a forest that seemed to be drawn on white paper. The trees were the big swampy kind you often saw in kids' art assignments, and it was clear that Father Hand was no artist. He wasn't a consistent narrator either, because his voice and his tone seemed to get angrier the longer the episode went on. The condition of the puppet looked ghastly, and that only added to the surreal horror of the show. The Lisa puppet was clearly in bad shape, and halfway through the show, a piece fell off of her and landed on the table. The narration ended abruptly, as the music continued over the visual of the graying puppet just standing in place. The sound of someone stomping off was audible over the jangly Discord, and the steps sounded heavy and angry. There was a brief moment of someone begging to be let go, but it cut away just as the sound of screaming started. The video was edited poorly, and an attempt had clearly been made to cut it out. When the show resumed, the Lisa puppet was complete again, with what appeared to be a hunk of fresh meat attached. The piece that had fallen off, however, still lay on the table, as though it were no more useful than a snakeskin now. Towards the end of the episode, the Lisa puppet bent over and seemed to weep as she was alone and scared in the forest. This weeping was overlaid by a soft and frantic weeping in the background as well, though I'm not sure we were meant to hear that part. All of a sudden, the Father Hand came and showed her the way home. It scolded her for running away, and told her she must never do that again. Much like an actual father, the hand seemed relieved as well as angry, and the meat Lisa went with him to the house meekly enough. When they returned, the Steve and Michael puppet did not seem happy to see her. They shunned her silently, and the episode ended with Lisa crying in a corner somewhere. Then the episode faded to black, and the credits rolled. I hovered my mouse over episode 6, not sure if I really wanted to watch it. Episode 4, called Thankless, made episode 5 make a lot more sense. Father Hand was still likely punishing Lisa for running away, though the start of the episode made it very clear that Lisa had just been going out for a walk. The episodes were easy enough to follow, but something in them still made me uneasy. Why were these characters living under this supposedly fatherly hand character? Why did the narrator call them roommates if the father hand treated them like his children? The whole show was just odd and had a very surreal nature to it. There seemed to be an underlying story that I just wasn't getting. I was invested, though, and I had to see how it came out. Episode 6 was the strangest by far, and the comments on the video seemed to prove that I wasn't just going crazy. It was called Melancholy, and the episode started with the same weird dance music and a shot of Lisa hunched up and crying. The crying, however, was not the canned sound it had been before. The episode was 3.5 minutes of someone sobbing heartbreakingly, the kind of sobs that are equal parts hopelessness and terror. The camera seemed to be slowly panning in on the intricate face of the meat puppet as the sobs in the background went on and on. I had seen some strange videos in my time, but this one definitely took the cake. The final shot was of the eye of the meat puppet, clearly defined and lovingly traced. You could see the meat beginning to mold, see the bright splotches that decorated the surface, and just before the screen faded to black, you could hear the elevated terror in the voice of the person sobbing before it was shut off by the end of the episode. I had to take a break after that one, reading the comments as I tried to make sense of what I had just watched. The Meat Man's audience seemed to be a little divided on whether this was an artistic expression or something much darker. A user had said that the sobbing and the screaming had been unique, and that they couldn't find it anywhere online, or at least on any of the free sites. Another user questioned whether they were too real or not, thinking this might be part of someone's torture fantasy, but others seemed to think it was just an avant-garde piece, and that was a little too pompous for its own good. What they did agree on was that even if it was acting, the screams were a little too real, and that they all felt some kind of way about those cries of anguish. I had hoped that maybe episode 7 would be a return to sanity, but episode 7, called Jealousy, was just as weird. The narrator was telling us that the Dawn character was adjusting very nicely to the house. All the tenants loved her. They all wanted to be her friend. And indeed, Father Han, Steve, and Michael were all standing around her and moving animatedly. Only one character, Lisa, didn't seem to want to be friends with Dawn. She seemed to be in another room, still hunkered up and crying. The narrator explained that Lisa was jealous of Dawn, and that Father was becoming cross with her attitude. The sobs from the previous episode were gone, but there were some other low noises, barely discernible over the loud jangling music. The puppets seemed to be in much better condition as well, and I suppose they had changed the meat out on them recently. The father hand came and yelled at Lisa some more, but she just stayed hunkered up and crying. Finally he left, and the episode ended as the camera zoomed in on the little meat woman hunkered in her anguish. I looked at the next episode and wondered if I really wanted to see more. It felt like I'd been watching for hours, but it turned out that all 7 episodes had taken less than 30 minutes. Something about watching the byplay between the characters had gripped me, and I felt that I needed to finish it. At the same time, there was something much darker here than I had expected. This was like someone's confession. The whole thing felt very intimate, and I felt almost voyeuristic for watching. I clicked the next episode, though, telling myself that another 3 episodes wouldn't do much damage. How wrong I'd been. Episode 8, called Hatred, opened with Lisa leaning against a paper wall as the others tried to get in her room. They started out nicely asking her to come out, wanting to talk, wanting to see her. The narrator told us that Lisa had been shirking her chores and saying unkind things to Father Hand about the other roommates. Father Hand had, of course, shared these things with the others, and now they wanted to talk to her. As their knocking became pounding, all 3 of them pushing and pulling at the door as they banged and kicked, Lisa pulled her hands to her ears and put her head between her knees. The narrator told us how Michael and Steve wanted to talk, and how Dawn was really upset that Lisa would judge her so hastily. As they pounded and banged on the paper door, Father Hand suddenly came into the scene. Lisa looked up from her knees and seemed unsure of what to make of the sudden appearance of the fatherly phalange. Father Hand told her that she had brought discord to the house, and that he could no longer ignore her insolence. The hand turned itself into a fist and began to beat the puppet savagely. Chunks of meat fell off and were squashed beneath the pounding. The wire body was twisted and warped, and the whole scene was made all the more horrific by the overlaying carnival tune that scratched like razors across my brain. It ended as Steve and Michael knocked, and the camera zoomed in on the sad pile of meat that Lisa had become. The episode ended abruptly, and when I saw a pale figure staring back at me from the suddenly dark screen, it took a half a second to realize it was the sweating image of myself. Episode 9, Contrition, was next, and there was no question on whether I would watch it or not. I needed to know what came next. I needed to know how this ended. Episode 9 was as different from the others as night to day. It was a shaky cam of someone walking through the woods by night. A butter yellow light provided a small patch of illumination, and whoever was recording was breathing heavily as they trudged through the woods. The woods were preternaturally silent as they went, and the leaves crunching underfoot were loud enough to be jarring. The video was 4 minutes long, and 3.5 minutes were nothing but walking feet, crunching leaves, and heavy breathing. Then abruptly, they stopped before a small round stone, the ground before it freshly turned up and put to rest sloppily. "Sleep well, Lisa," came the phlegmy voice of the cameraman. Then it all went black again. I hit the 10th episode before I could think about it, wanting to see how it ended. Episode 10, Ambivalence, seemed to be a return to normal. Dawn was sitting on the couch, seeming to laugh at something on the TV that was out of view. Michael and Steve seemed to be milling about, cleaning up or just chatting. The wall that had marked Lisa's room was nowhere to be seen. The father hand looked over all of them, benevolently, as the narrator told us about Michael looking for a book he had misplaced, and Dawn watching her favorite TV show. All seemed well. All seemed normal, other than the broken corpse of Lisa that lay on the floor. The damage that Father Hand had done still lay about the ground, and the meat was brown and dry. Flies had begun to circle the meat body, and if one of the puppets had to go near her, they seemed to walk over her body without noticing her. The only character who seemed to notice her was the Father Hand. He would look down at her from time to time, almost smugly, and shake his head before looking back at the other puppets happily. Episode 10 went dark, and I was yet again left wondering what I had seen. The video seemed to have moved into my head rent-free, in less time than it would have taken to watch a movie. I had moved on to other videos, other activities, but the images were never far from my mind. I'd been known to suggest strange videos to friends of mine, even link them on Reddit to certain groups. This one, however, was not one of them. I was hesitant to talk about it, let alone tell people about it. I did not want others to suffer under this like I had, and that was probably why I was thinking about it when I saw the poster. I was traveling for work. I work as an expert witness for specific cases, and I do a lot of traveling and a lot of waiting, which often leads to the aforementioned boredom. I was driving through Michigan when a call to nature became too much to ignore, and I had to pull over at a nearby rest stop. I was heading to the bathroom when I saw the missing persons wall. My eyes found the woman before I could stop myself, and my breath caught in my throat as I came up short. The woman's name was Elizabeth Rainey, 23, and she'd been missing for the last 4 months. The poster was new, unmarred by yellowing or creasing, and I pulled it easily from the bulletin board. Looking at her face, I realized how much had gone into each of those puppets. Her nose, her wide forehead, the small dimple in her chin, the dent in her left cheek from some childhood accident. They were all there. They had all been lovingly added to the porous face of that meat puppet. I took the poster back to my car, my check-in time approaching quickly, and called a friend of mine who works with the local police department. I told him about the girl, about the YouTube channel, about the videos, and he said he'd look into it without much enthusiasm. When he called me about a week later to thank me for the information, he sounded much more interested in what I had to say. I called him again a few weeks ago and offered to buy him a drink if he'd sate my curiosity. He was willing, but said I might not want to know as bad as I thought. Over drinks, he told me the whole sad story. My friend had a friend too. His friend was an agent with the FBI, and after watching the videos, my friend had called his friend. He sent him a link to the channel and asked him to take a look. After his friend had watched the drama for himself, he had tracked the IP to see what he could find. Turned out that Elizabeth wasn't the only familiar face that was missing in the Michigan area. Michael Chavez, Steve Schwote, and Don Lee were also missing from the same area. The IP address was coming from an old house near Lake Huron. The owner, David Matthews, owned the house and quite a lot of the acreage out there. When they had raided his house, they had caught David by surprise and found more than they bargained for. He had been keeping them in his basement. The sick bastard had a large finished basement with 4 separate rooms. The central room held a couch, a TV, and a large kitchen table with a small set for the show and a camera. The puppets were on a shelf nearby, their bodies gray and sagging off their clothes hanger bodies. The other implement in the room was a large, rusty meat grinder. A meat grinder with strands of rotting meat hanging from the spout. He had said flies had been thick in the room, and the sounds of moans had not begun until they started kicking down doors. Dawn, Michael, and Steve had been laying in their respective rooms. Most of them, anyway, my friend had said, taking a long pull from his beer. He sent me the photos of the crime scene. I wish to God he hadn't. Dawn had been in the room that had likely once belonged to Elizabeth. David had been in the room that had likely once belonged to Elizabeth. He'd been wearing her dress, the fabric badly stretched around his frame, and was sobbing in the corner. No matter what the agents had said to him, his response was always the same, his rocking making a strange grinding noise as his bottom slid over the concrete. He kept saying, "I shouldn't have played God. I shouldn't have made her sleep." Again and again and again. The others didn't say much of anything. He had scooped them to the bone, cutting off fingers and toes, arms and legs, so he could grind them up to make those damn puppets. He'd used tourniquets and animal tranquilizers to keep them alive. Michael and Steve were a little more than torsos, Steve having half a leg and Michael a little more than an elbow. Dawn was missing her legs, but her arms were thankfully intact. She'd only been in the basement for a month, and it seemed he hadn't had much time to take from her. They had gotten all of them out of there, and David Matthews, the meat man, was now in custody. "A real win for the good guys," my friend had said, his stare 1,000 miles long, "though none of them will ever walk again. The men are in a catatonic state, and the girl only gibbers. But at least we saved them before he could finish his sick little play." They had yet to find Lisa's body, but he told me they hadn't given up yet. As I sit here, going over the facts as I write, it all just runs through my head like a rat in a maze. Every moan, every sob was this sicko harvesting his victims so he could replace the flesh of his precious puppets. I was an unwilling participant in this, watching and encouraging this sick bastard to continue. I want to forget it, but I can't. I may never forget what I saw in that short hour of my life. I may never forget the terrible knowledge that the meat man has invested in me, and I may find my curiosity sated for quite some time. I think my days of roaming YouTube in my boredom may be at an end.